Okay, we're just waiting to make sure we're live on YouTube here, and then we'll get going. Okay, thanks, Elizabeth. Oh, all right, welcome everyone, and I'm going to call this meeting to order at 9:03. This is a special planning committee meeting for the Minett OPA. For the draft number 56 for the official name. I am verbally going to acknowledge that we have a quorum. Councillor Hayes sends her regrets, and Councillor Nishikawa, I believe, will probably come on in a few minutes. We have the CAO, our clerk, our Director of Development Services and Environmental Sustainability, and other staff present. I also want to acknowledge that we did have input from planning at muskokalakes.ca. Today's meeting is being live streamed and recorded on the Township of Muskoka Lakes website and YouTube channel. By participating in the open public meeting today, you are consenting to your image, voice, and comments being recorded and posted online. So I'm also going to acknowledge a supplementary agenda. The one that was published contained several names that are no longer going to speak. Mr. Pearce informed me last night that Brenda Pearce, David Pearce, and Amanda Pearce will not be speaking in our public comments section. So I am going to ask for any disclosures of pecuniary interest? All right, seeing none, I'm first going to acknowledge also that our wonderful clerk of 35 years, Cheryl? 34. Well, yeah, 34 years with us. This is her last meeting, and you'll see the smile on her face. So we want to thank Cheryl for all of those years. And we'll miss you. I'll miss you. It's lots of fun in here. So, and also welcome our new clerk, Lauren Tarasuk. Lauren, welcome. If you can take over, and next time we'll be saying hi to you. So, and also I want to welcome Mr. McDonald, who of course is doing our OPA, and I think that's it for. Morning, Nick. How are you? Good. All right. So today's meeting, we are going to let Mr. Pink sort of introduce things, and Mr. McDonald is going to go over the changes. But before I get there, I really want to thank everybody, and most of the people who did write in before will be speaking today, for submitting your comments before. It was so helpful this past weekend to have those to read and look at and organize. So for today, after we get through the delegations, I would like to, I've got all my notes here from those letters that came in, go item by item on issues that were raised from those letters. And then if our committee, and I'm sure some of them will be the same as committee may have. So, and after that, we will go to committee and ask for their input. So that's sort of the outline today. So first of all, I'm going to ask Mr. Pink just to introduce us off, and then I believe Mr. McDonald will take over. Mr. Pink.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, committee, and those members of the community watching and staff. Obviously, we're all here today to go over official plan amendment number 56 for the resort village of Minett. It's been a very lengthy process to date, but more recently, what I would like to highlight how we got here. We did have a public meeting on draft 1 of OPA 56 back in May 28th of this year. We did return to planning committee on August 6th, and we staff, both Mr. McDonald and I, reviewed those public submissions that were received at that public meeting, provided a planning analysis of those, and received direction from committee and council as to changes to OPA 56. So what you have before you today is draft 2 as a result of that direction and those changes that were made. I'll allow Mr. McDonald to go through some of the more significant changes in a bit more detail in a moment. And just lastly, would highlight the submissions that we did receive since the public meeting and more recently, and they were all forwarded to committee. I'm happy to go over those if committee has any questions, but we did receive submissions from a Scott Rutledge, Robert Silcox, and Ken Selby. Planscape on behalf of the Rossa Resort Developments and Legacy Cottages. Paula Bustard on behalf of the Penguin Group of Companies, the Muskoka Ratepayers Association, Muskoka Lakes Association, and Friends of Muskoka. And we did also receive the speaking notes from Ian Newall on behalf of the Royal Muskoka Island Association. We'll be speaking later. So after Mr. McDonald goes through those highlighted changes, as we heard from the chair, there's also a number of delegates who wish to speak today. And staff and Mr. McDonald here are here to answer any questions you may have as we work through this process. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Pink. Mr. McDonald?
Yes, good morning, Chair Bridgman. My name is Nick McDonald, of course, and I'm here to talk to you about the Minett official plan amendment. I'll echo David's comments. There has been a lot of work put into this document. And before you, you have both a track changes version that shows all of the changes made since the public meeting, and then a changes accepted version as well. As committee will recall, we met in July to review a number of recommendations I was making at the time with respect to changes to the official plan amendment that I felt were required. And we had a good discussion about those changes at the time. And that's where I'm going to start. I'm going to go through the recommendations made and the decisions made by Planning Committee and Council at that time, and then review any other changes that were made since that time. So the first, so I'm going to jump right into it. There were, I think, 8 or 9 recommendations made in my July 29th of 2021 report to Planning Committee. Don't need to pull up the report. I'll very briefly go through what the recommendation was, what Council decided, and how it was implemented within the draft. So the first matter dealt with in my report at that time was dealt with density and the number of units. And I had indicated that the proponent, Smart Centers, the Penguin Group of Companies, indicated that they were willing to reduce the number of units proposed on the lands that were R1 and R2 by 299. I was supportive of that. Planning Committee also agreed with that, but directed that there not be any indication of exactly where those units would come off of. As you'll recall, there are specific unit counts, unit caps established for the village core and the resort commercial lands, and then specific unit caps for the R1 and R2 lands. So in order to implement Planning Committee's direction, I left the individual unit caps for each of those areas in the official plan amendment, but then put in a notwithstanding that basically says, notwithstanding anything else, you cannot exceed the total number of units specified in the document. This allows the proponent to determine in which area there will be a reduction, and that decision would be made through a future master planning process. So that's number one, and I'm assuming we'll come back to some of these things as we get into the discussion later. Next item was the non-red leaves lands. I had indicated in the July report that I had some concerns about including such a large amount of land within the settlement area boundary. There wasn't apparently any discussion in many of the meetings on these lands regarding what would happen on them, what the future vision was for them. And my initial reaction was to indicate that a future official plan amendment would be required to deal with them once such a vision was established. At the July meeting, I indicated that perhaps we should take those lands right off the table, delete them from the schedules, remove any permissions from them, and also do the same thing with a small area of land just to the south and east of the JW Marriott lands on the waterfront. That recommendation was endorsed. Following that decision, Mr. Pink reached out to all of the landowners affected by that change. And my understanding is he's heard back from one who indicated no concerns, but no responses from any of the others. I'm satisfied that we've done our due diligence in terms of identifying which lands are going to be taken off the table and reaching out to folks to get their feedback and comments. We've heard back from one. I'm satisfied that we've done our job to advise those who may be affected by this change. So all of the schedules have been amended to remove those non-red leaves portions of the settlement area off the table. There still is some NRL lands along Jothaven Road, which is not owned by the proponent. Those lands should still stay in, and we've included those within the amendment. Third item dealt with servicing. The District of Muskoka recommended that there be a servicing schedule established or included within the official plan amendment. The purpose of the servicing schedule would be to identify where the full service area is and where the future service area is. The full service areas are areas where full services are required and where they will be established first, and future service areas are areas where services will be extended later at some time when a proposal is submitted to the township and district for those lands. This is how the district deals with every settlement area within the district. So instead of including a schedule to the township's plan, we've decided to put that information on an appendix, and it is in your package. And it is anticipated that the District of Muskoka official plan would also have to be amended to include a similar schedule or appendix as well to provide direction on where the full service lands are. So what we've done is we've included all of the lands owned by the Penguin Group of companies within the full service area. We've also included the JW property, and we've included the legacy property as well. That was another of the recommendations made at the time, to include the legacy lands within the full service area. It's recognized that there is a private communal services exist on the property now, but when full services are established, it is expected that those lands would be connected. Given the location of a property between the Cleveland House property and the legacy lands, I believe it's owned by Mr. Paul Richards, we've also included those lands within the full service area. It is noted that while the policies do indicate that proponents would be paying for the establishment of the plant, it was never our intent to put that on the back of Mr. Richards. That really was the intent to put that solely in the responsibility of the Penguin Group of companies. So perhaps a slight wording change is needed to reflect that intent. In addition, there was a request to include the proposed location of the plant on the schedules, and that has also been done. The next item dealt with setbacks from the water's edge. I had recommended that there be some flexibility with respect to the vegetative buffer and the setback from the water's edge. My rationale was that since this is a settlement area, much like how the district deals with urban centers, there should be some flexibility, allows for different types of design ideas to be considered, and so on. It is recognized that there already are a number of buildings and structures within the setback area. Those would be protected in any event. So Planning Committee was generally supportive of the approach. However, there was direction to ensure that no residential or resort development would be permitted within those setbacks areas or vegetative buffers. So changes have been made to the official plan amendment to make that clear. I should note as well that because we're introducing some flexibility with respect to setbacks, that a change to the District of Muskoka official plan would also be required. As some of you or all of you know, the district's lake system health policy framework is pretty specific in terms of the requirements it sets out for setbacks. But flexibility is provided in urban centers, but it doesn't provide any flexibility in what they call special policy areas, which is what the Minett Resort Village is. So there will be a need to change the district's plan in any event. I should note while I'm on the topic that we always thought that there would be a need to update the district's plan to make sure that it is in sync with whatever we're coming up with in OPA 56, if only to ensure that the visions are aligned, the permissions are aligned, and the conditions under which development can occur are also aligned. I should note that the policies in the current district plan are quite different than what we're proposing, and I think that kind of alignment would be important going forward. I know the district has been open to modifying and updating its official plan. We just have to figure out how to initiate that process, and I'm thinking it's something the township would have to initiate by asking through council resolution that the district update its plan to implement or reflect what the local official plan is going to be saying. With respect to height, I recommended that there be a 16-meter height limit established within the official plan amendment. That would include mechanical. There was agreement that that could be included within the official plan amendment. So that has been done. We did provide some additional direction on where higher buildings could be located, i.e. not adjacent to the shoreline, could be further back. And we also indicated that we would include a policy in here that would require the preparation of a master height plan through the master planning process that would identify where the higher buildings are located, how they relate to topographical features and the tree line, so that there would be an opportunity to review this in some more detail later. So policies on that have been included. Item number 6 dealt with implementation, and I had recommended that there was a need to provide some additional clarity on how these policies would be implemented. My view was that they should all be implemented at the same time through a master planning process that would be initiated when the proponent submits an application for rezoning. So quite a bit of additional policy has been added into the implementation section. So for example, we've added a traffic impact study to the requirements, the master height plan that I've mentioned, a master parks plan, financial impact assessment. We've updated the urban design and architectural guideline policies as well. And we've also indicated that the terms of reference for each of these studies would need to be run by the township before they are initiated, so that there is clarity on exactly what work is going to be done. Item number 7 dealt with dockage. As you'll know, we initially had a number of docks listed in the official plan amendment at 215. There was quite a bit of discussion about exactly how many docks are permitted and or are legal in Wallace Bay. And Mr. Pink and I, before the last meeting, discussed this matter and decided that it might be much easier for us to indicate that instead of putting a number in here, to say that all legal docks are permitted, legally existing or legally approved docks are permitted, and that any increase in that number would require a number of studies before they are approved. Much simpler. That was discussed with Planning Committee. Planning Committee agreed, and that change was made to the amendment. Item number 8 dealt with staff housing. I recommended that it be a requirement, and the policies were included in that regard. In looking at it now, after reviewing the many comments received, I agree the language could be a little stronger with respect to staff housing. I did make it a requirement, but there was some language before it that makes it a little bit more flexible than I thought it should be, so that could be updated. And the last item dealt with strengthening the amendment for clarity purposes, and I had indicated that I would be going through the amendment with a fine-tooth comb and cleaning up the language and making things clear wherever I possibly could, so that implementation was easier as the process unfolds. So I'm going to go through very quickly some of the clarification changes that I've made through the amendment, and we can certainly discuss any of these when it gets to that time. But what I did do in the document is clarified how this amendment functions and works with other aspects of the township's official plan. And essentially, this amendment is intended to take precedence over other policies in the plan, so there is no confusion later on about how it is to be implemented. In addition, and as per our discussions on the official plan itself, I went through the entire document and tried to find every word that sounded like encourage or will or may, and if appropriate, change those to shall, where I thought that kind of clarity and direction was necessary. So a number of changes were made to include that clarity. I also made it very clear that any changes to the foundational elements in the official plan amendment, such as the unit counts and so on, would require an amendment to the official plan. That clarity wasn't there initially, so that clarity has been included. A number of references to the natural environment and protecting the natural environment were also included throughout the document as well. As I go through it, so with respect to servicing, I did make one change to the servicing policies that I thought were appropriate. And it basically comes down to, if we're going to be identifying a full service area where full services are required, that should be the only type of services permitted within that area, similar to any other urban center where we have full services. So I removed any permissions for private communal services within the Minett Resort Village. It doesn't make any sense to me to open that door and allow for private communal services, particularly in circumstances where there are concerns about how these potential units would be occupied over the longer term, whether they would turn to residential uses, which is a concern of this committee and council. And I felt that it was appropriate to be very clear about that requirement. And we've discussed it with the proponent as well. The proponent is not opposed to this being the only form of servicing permitted going forward. And quite frankly, I think it's the only way to go. The environmental assessment completed in this area recommended full services. It is the way to ensure the protection of the environment occurs through the implementation process. So we have made that change within the policy framework. Moving along, and I'm just flipping pages and looking at my highlighted areas. We did include some language from the existing official plan that deals with shoreline development and how areas along the shoreline should be maintained in its natural vegetative state wherever possible. We did provide some additional direction on what should happen in the vegetated buffers adjacent to the shoreline. We did provide some flexibility with respect to land use designation boundaries. The proponent indicated that they may want to look at Peninsula Road and where it was located, may want to move it slightly. And we wanted to make sure that the designation boundaries would move with the road and we wouldn't need to go through an official plan amendment. As per discussions on the official plan itself, we did add in some very explicit policy that required that wherever resort commercial accommodation units were proposed, they are required to generate a turnover of occupants, just like we're suggesting in the official plan. We're requiring in-person management being available on site, which is what we're also including within the draft official plan, and also requiring a variety of resort-related amenities and services available on the site, again, to be consistent with the direction being taken in the draft official plan as well. We've also applied the occupancy restrictions to the JW Marriott lands and the legacy lands as well. We did provide some additional flexibility with respect to the lands that remain in the non-red leaves designation. There are some commercial uses on those lands. We didn't want to be too arbitrary and not permit anything to occur. So we have provided some flexibility in terms of permitting minor residential and commercial development on those lands in advance of them being redeveloped. Lastly, we did include all of the policies on occupancy, which were previously in an appendix within the official plan itself. That's a pretty significant change. My initial view was policies on occupancy and who can reside in a unit really don't belong in an official plan, but I recognize the sensitivity of this in the township. So instead of it all being within an appendix, it has been included within section C.1 or C1.8 of the document. in C1.9 as well. And we made a number of minor changes to the wording throughout to make them a little bit clearer. Last point is a number of comments and very detailed comments have been made by many over the last 2 or 3 days. I think there are some good ideas in some of it, and we'll hear from the delegates today, and certainly open to discussing how this amendment can be improved. I will note that the less flexible we make this document, the more challenging it will be to implement, and the less flexible design approaches could be, and the less flexibility is afforded to the proponent, which I think you'll hear this morning in their delegation. In any event, that's what I had for today in terms of an update. I'm not sure when we're going to talk about all of these. It's whether it's now or after the delegations, but I'm in your hands, Chair Bridgman.
Well, thank you, Mr. McDonald. We'll talk about it after the delegations, and I'm going to move to them, but Councillor Jaglowitz, do you have a procedural question at this point?
Thank you, Chair. No, it was just a clarification on the first point that he mentioned. I can do it now or do it later. It's your call.
No, well, let's clarify it so everybody understands.
Okay, so I'm confused, Mr. McDonald, on the density issue. You indicated that there was going to be a reduction of 299. You indicated it's not reflected in the draft, but you said notwithstanding, it was up to the proponent to decide where to reduce it. I just couldn't find that in the document. Maybe you could just clarify how you've dealt with that. Thank you.
Okay.
Mr. McDonald?
Yeah. Yes, so if we look at section C 1.4.3.3 as an example, and I'm looking at the track changes version, but you can look at the other version as well. So essentially it would say in this particular case, the total equivalent unit count for the lands identified shall not exceed 882. And then you'll see a new sentence that says, notwithstanding the above, and this other section C1436, the total combined equivalent unit count for the lands identified in Schedule C and D shall not exceed 2020. So essentially the individual unit numbers have been retained for the R1 and R2 lands and the village core RC1, RC2 lands, so that they are allowed to develop up to that number on both, but there's a cap that basically says you can't develop up to that number on both because there is an overall cap on the number of units. We didn't know how to implement planning committee's direction. The Penguin group of companies proposed to reduce the number on the R1, R2 lands only, and I was okay with that. But planning committee did not want to identify where the reduction occurred. So this was our way of implementing planning committee's direction.
Quick supplementary, but if you add 882 and 1117, they add up to 2020. So that the overall cap hasn't been reduced, at least in my calculation. Should the overall cap be a lower number, Mr. McDonald? I have to check that again, but the 2020 does also include the JW Marriott and the legacy lands as well. Okay, then that isn't clear in the document, at least in my reading of it. So maybe you could address that at some point. So if it does include the JW Marriott, that's the 221 plus the 55. I see.
That's correct.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Yes, Mr. McDonald, I struggled with that too. So I think anybody looking at this, it is unclear, which we're going to hear from the delegates, I'm sure. Okay, so we will move on to our delegates now. Our invited delegation, our first speaker is Mr. Newall. If we want to bring him in, Elizabeth, thank you. Welcome, Mr. Newall.
Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you. Just your name and address, and then I'm going to give you 5 minutes. And because we have a lot of delegates here and a lot to talk about, I am going to be fairly strict about my 5 minutes today. So I'll give you a 15-second warning. I know you're usually fairly precise. So please go ahead.
Thank you. Ian Newall, 1043 Sagamo Boulevard, Royal Muskoka Island, Minett. Thank you, members of committee, Chair Bridgman, and all present, for the opportunity to speak once again today on behalf of the 90 waterfront property owners of Royal Muskoka Island. We're on the doorstep here. It's been a long road, and I'd like to thank everyone involved for their commitment for sticking with it since 2018. A lot of people have been involved along the way, I won't dive into all the words in my letter. I submitted a letter on Saturday. Thank you, and sorry for not having done so Friday as you had requested, Chair Bridgman. But I want to particularly call out Mitch Goldhar for having stuck with the process as well. He didn't have to, but he did, and it allowed the process to proceed as it should. And I think that's commendable, and thank you. Everyone else here deserves a round of applause and a strong drink. So many of the changes that were recommended in the previous round of consultation have been incorporated, and that's wonderful. And I especially appreciate the one that redefined the Minett boundary to exclude most of the non-red leaves lands. I think that's a breakthrough. So the comments that I offer today are just a few small things. Well, one biggie. And that is in addition to the recommendations put forward by the Friends of Muskoka and Muskoka Lakes Association. The one that I want to particularly call your attention to is in the owner unit usage provisions in section C19. We've gone to great lengths to make this the owner use provisions watertight. And I think we've done so, but there's a bit of I think, an unintentional slip in the lingo that's been used that actually guts it. And I think it's easily fixed, but we have to make sure we fix it. So as we define unit owner in C18 as including all forms of ownership, so be it individual, partnership, corporations, trusts, and other entities. But then when we're describing what owners can do with their properties, we limit it unintentionally, I believe, to individual owners, which leaves a huge policy gap for anything that's owned in a trust or in a corporation or in a partnership or a timeshare. All those are left uncovered by the owner use provisions. So I think we can fix that very easily by replacing the qualifiers that say if the unit is owned individually. We can fix it by replacing that sentence with if the unit is owned by a unit owner as defined in C18. And that immediately fixes the problem and gets rid of the policy gap. This is all outlined in the letter, so I won't get into all the clauses where that comes into play. The next thing I would like to recommend is that with the shorelines in sections C1544 and 1545, where we have the vegetative buffer, I think we should tighten up a little bit the types of exceptions we're willing to consider reducing that 15-meter buffer. As at the moment, the language is only recreational and other amenities would be considered, but other amenities can mean a lot of things. So I think it would be more appropriate if we qualified that as only recreational and other amenities that are waterfront related. And with that simple fix, it becomes clear that the intent is, docks, boathouses, trails, boardwalks, and waterfront related amenities of that nature could be considered for vegetative buffer reduction. In C175, implementation, I think it's important that an environmental impact assessment should be included among the required studies, and that all of the studies listed should be required to be integrated into the master development plan. And lastly, I think I'll come in well under 5 minutes here. Insofar as development of this scale might affect nearby Bruce Lake, their water quality, I think it would be very neighborly of us to include them in water quality protection mentions. So that happens in a couple of places, C1.2 in strategy and C1.4.2b character. We should include protect the water quality of Wallace Bay and Bruce Lake. It seems self-evident, but it's worth mentioning. And anyway, so I think in closing, this has been a long and winding road since 2018. And this document that we're considering today is not perfect, but it's a heck of a lot better than the policy that it will be replacing. And I'd like to thank everyone for their involvement and their commitment and sticking with it and getting us to this point. If we're able to close these last little loopholes, I think we'll be far better off than we have been exposed to for the last umpteen years. So thank you, and I appreciate the time to speak to you today, and thank you all for your service.
Thank you, Mr. Newell, and you've been an intricate part of those discussions. So it's been a team effort, which has been, I believe, brought us to where we are now. So thank you. All right, Mr. Richards, you bring Mr. Richards in. Okay, I think we're just there. I think you're connected now, Mr. Richards, but your microphone's off. Paul, would you like to unmute yourself? Can we unmute him? Can we unmute him, Elizabeth?
I can ask him.
Oh, you can just ask him to unmute, but that'll
Yeah.
come up on the screen. So let's try that. Okay. Paul, we can't, you're on mute, Paul. Oh, here you come. Well, you're still on mute. I can now see you, but we can't hear you. There you go.
Oh, good. I kept pressing it. It wouldn't work.
Yeah, technology, right? So, okay, so go ahead, Mr. Richards. I'm going to, I don't know if you could hear me, but I'm going to keep the timelines really tight today. So we have lots of time for discussion. So please go ahead.
I'll do my best. Madam Chair, Councilor, staff, and guests, Paul Richards, 2060 Peninsula Road. That's the property sandwiched between Legacy and Cleveland's house. I'm going to leave out a few things just because of time, and I'm going to leave out the reference numbers, but they're all in my written report, and I hope you have a copy of it or will have one soon. I will be speaking this morning on 3 issues: on-site management, staff accommodation, and septic, and possibly a fourth transportation time permitting. On-site management. Present wording: in-person management shall be available on-site in order to respond to complaints, deal with emergencies, and assist guests and visitors. The appropriate management arrangement will depend upon the scale, location, on-site, resort-related amenities, and desired experience of the resort. Observation: Cleveland's House and the Marriott will not require any recommendation regarding on-site management. They will always have it. This leaves Legacy, and they have already signed an agreement regarding their commitment to on-site management. Recommendation: the entire clause should be replaced with what has already been approved and agreed by the Legacy developer on the Legacy Site Plan Agreement, September 23rd, 2017, Section 518. The owner further agrees that management facilities shall be located on-site and staff available at all times the resort is occupied. Some may say that on-site management is not required in the shoulder seasons when there may only be a few occupants. On the contrary, this is the time of the most danger because young people rent through Airbnbs and Party Central takes over. Ask the people in Collingwood who've suffered greatly from this issue. Staff accommodation. As it stands, the OPA refers to staff accommodation in two separate places. In neither case does it raise the central issue. Where is this staff accommodation to be located? I insist that it has to be within Minett. The horrible experience of allowing the Marriott to proceed without staff housing has been a disaster for Paula, for the roads, and for the commuting employees. There is not a single available bed for resort employees in Minett. Indeed, almost all the land in Minett is owned by the developers themselves. This means that the dormitory style housing must be built on their own resort properties. Just let me tell you about Jamie, our wonderful post office mistress. At one point, she was commuting from Gravenhurst to get to the post office in Minett because there was nothing available.
Mr. Richards,
Yes.
Mr. Richards, you have told us that story before, so.
That's true.
So to help you move on, let's keep it, let's move on from there.
Yep. Thank you. The next clause deals with accommodation for staff for the small businesses on employment lands, assuming that the employment lands means the so-called village core. The wording there needs to be clarified. Present wording, efforts shall be made to protect and enhance employment lands by requiring the development of staff housing for the employees of the various businesses in the Minett Resort Village. The use of the phrase efforts shall be made is evasive and invites non-compliance. And as I just pointed out, there is no mention of where this staff housing is to be located. Recommendation, requiring the development of staff accommodation housing for a minimum of 50% of the anticipated requirement for the employees of the various businesses of the Minett Resort Village on resort property. 2, deals with accommodation for staff, the resort proper. Present wording, dormitory style accommodation for resort employees. Observation, these dormitories must be on resort property. Recommendation, Part C to read as follows. Dormitory style accommodation for all seasonal employees must be provided on the resort property. Septic, present wording last line. The full cost of installing municipal sewage services and Minett water services will be the responsibility of the landowners who will benefit from the installation of such services. Observation, it would be unreasonable and wrong to assess residential and small commercial enterprises, example, the corner store, for the capital costs of installing a new septic plant, including principal distribution piping.
That's your cue, Mr. Richards, you have 15 seconds.
To be reworded. The full cost of installing municipal sewage services, municipal water services will be the responsibility of the developer and related commercial resorts at that. Roads and transportation, although the costs for improvement are to be at no cost to the district or township, far more information will be
Hey,
required.
Mr. Richards, your time is up.
We love Minett.
Thank you very much for your presentation, and please send us your notes and we'll be able to read it from there. Okay, thank you. Okay, Ms. Bustard. Okay, there you are, Ms. Bustard. Welcome.
Good morning, Chair Bridgman. Can you hear me okay?
I can, so please, as you know, I think you know, we have 5 minutes and please carry on.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here and to speak to you all about the latest draft of the OPA. Paula Bustard with Penguin Group of Companies. I will try to keep my comments brief. I did put a written submission in last night and I apologize for the late hour. All in all, I'd just like to thank everyone for all the hard work to get to this point. We've come a long way, and I know there's a lot of concessions that have been made by everyone We have really approached this over the last couple of years to try to be as accommodating as possible and to find a common ground with all the stakeholders to make sure that this is an OPA that everyone can support. I think we're close, but there are 7 critical issues in the latest draft that do cause us some serious concern. As an overall statement, one thing I've been very consistent in every deputation I've made is my concern about the overly prescriptive nature of the OPA. We are still going to be going through a very robust rezoning process and site plan application for every phase of this development. Policies inherently become more restrictive and prescriptive as you go down from OPA, zoning, and site plan. My concern is that the prescriptive nature of some of these elements at the OPA are going to stifle creativity and stifle flexibility for us to have meaningful discussions at the zoning and site plan stage. Even good ideas might get shelved because we've arbitrarily put in OPA policies that are more appropriately placed in a zoning bylaw. So the flexibility we're asking for today is not a blanket open door to allow us to do anything. It is simply deferring some of these discussions to the implementation policies of the zoning bylaw and to the technical studies that will be done in conjunction with those and will be fully discussed with stakeholders, with council, with staff, and with the district. So I will quickly go through our 7 critical issues that cause us serious concern about the latest draft before us. Height limit. We are generally supportive of the 16 meter limit for residential uses, but we don't feel that it should be a blanket height limit across the totality of the site. There are uses such as hotel and the wellness center that might have architectural details that exceed beyond that height limit and might be a good idea. We're asking for some flexibility to allow non-residential uses to potentially exceed that height if deemed appropriate and desirable through the zoning process. The 16 meters was determined by using a 3 meter height for 5-story buildings. That is purely residential. A commercial wellness recreational building would not have a 3 meter height. So you really are reducing the height of that wellness center well below a 5-story height. The other issue, which is very critical to us, is a blanket policy mandating public access through the site. As I'm sure everyone here can attest to, just a blanket policy for public access, absent of a plan, absent of the detailed master planning, is not appropriate and I think could cause a lot of problems throughout Muskoka if we are setting a precedent at an OP level policy mandating public access through private property. That is something that we're very concerned from a security, liability, enforcement, and implementation. And we think that there's unintended consequences of a blanket public access policy that's been written into here. Boat slips, Mr. McDonald walked you through the history of it. Respectfully, I somewhat disagree with him and Mr. Pink's position. The 215 has been identified through existing on site and permits that exist for additional slips. We think it is important that the 215 get enshrined in policy as opposed to being ambiguous in the OPA. We're happy to provide more documentation that shows the legal approval for those 215 spots, but we think that number should be carried through in the documentation. Areas of use limitation. This version of the OPA reduced the areas of limitation from 40% slope to 20% slope with no justification whatsoever. Many properties on our lands and lands throughout Minett have slopes of 20%. I think, again, this is something that from a policy perspective sounds good, but there's going to be many unintended consequences here. If we obliterate all areas of 20% slope from potentially having any development, we are in fact actually densifying the portions of the site that don't have those slope limitations. So again, a blanket policy that is not giving any credence to the site-specific characteristics in master planning might actually result in higher densities and less diversification of uses throughout the site. And will force increased densities to promote urban forms that might be inconsistent with what we've discussed today. So we ask that that be changed back to 20%. The shoreline building setbacks at 20 meters. Again, we appreciate the exemptions that have been put into the policies, but again, we ask that there be some flexibility here that some new uses can be within the 20 meter setback if justified through the rezoning application. Again, in my opening statements, we feel that this blanket policy is not really obviously in the best interest of coming up with a holistic master plan. And there might be components that we want exceptions that everyone agrees to, but this policy would stifle the ability to even have that conversation. Again, I'm going to reiterate that there's going to be many technical
Ms.
studies.
Bustard, could you, I'm sorry, could you wrap it up?
Yep. 30 seconds. Floodplain, again, this one I will just say very quickly, although we are fully supportive of the protection of the environment and the environmentally sensitive areas, flexibility should be built in this policy for site-specific floodplain mapping and not relying on the district mapping that doesn't take site-specific data into consideration. So the technical studies and site-specific data should be used to determine those floodplain boundaries. And lastly, the holding provisions, we think there's enough protections in the phasing policies and the holding provisions are overly onerous. So those are 7 areas of concern for us, and we ask that those be refined prior to final adoption. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Okay, we are going to now move on to public comments. And Mr. Pearce, I believe, is up first. So, Mr. Pearce, you're in. I think your microphone is off. There you go. Yeah, I believe you're fine now. So as you know, I'm keeping strict limits right now. So please, your 2 minutes after you introduce yourself, please go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Chair Bridgman, committee members, staff, and guests. Ken Pearce, 2232 Muskoka Road, 169. I just wanted to speak on 2 topics. Height, thank you for adding in a height restriction not to exceed 16 meters or the existing mature tree canopy. I have a concern though, this is the greater of or an either or scenario. Therefore, if there's tree cover that's 80 feet or even 100 feet, this would permit 80 or 100-foot buildings. And I suggest this was probably not what was intended. I think it should read that it's the lesser of the 16 meters or the existing mature tree canopy. The second comment is, and I did hear Ms. Bustard just now, but my understanding is that the height restriction elsewhere in the township is 14 meters, not 16 meters. I think in an earlier draft, I'm not sure if it's in there now, that for the village core, that there could be an iconic building or buildings which could have greater height. And I heard the wellness center and a hotel, but again, as we've seen, the Marriott is only a 4-story building, but it's very prominent up on the hill there. So I would invite you to consider that very carefully. My second area is the district letter. It had about 14 points in it. Most of them were picked up. I think the district is going to require all of them. We set out in the joint FOM-MLA letter, there's a few that haven't been picked up or dealt with or not fully. 2 of them were cross references to the district OP. One was concerning environmental matters and the requirement for an EIS, environmental impact study. Of course, environment first is your mantra and very important. The second area is the cross reference to the district resort policy. And as we saw from the legacy LPAT decision, without having the reference to the district's resort policy, it can be very problematic. The last area was waste management. The district recommended that it be included within your institutional uses along with waste treatment facility, etc. I think you're going to need a transfer station. The number of people in this area could increase dramatically.
So wrap it up, Mr. Pearce, please.
Yep. And that might be located at the waste treatment facility site. As the staff report said, perhaps Mr. Pink and Mr. McDonald could take a closer look at the district letter to ensure that all of the matters they raised are fully addressed. As you know, the district is the final.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Pearce.
Thank you. Those are my comments.
Okay, thank you. All right, Ms. Eplett, can bring her in. Welcome, Ms. Eplett. You're on mute. And you're still on mute. There you go. Can you hear me?
Yes, I
I
can hear you.
I can hear you. Okay, listen, please go ahead, and I've got my high-tech timer here. So
Okay. I'm
So
sorry,
I've
I can't change that name, but it's Susan Eplett. I'm sorry.
no,
Thank you
no.
very
Okay.
much.
Okay, Ms.
Thank you.
Eplett, go ahead, please.
Okay. Thank you. Oh, you know what? I need to turn off my other screen or I'm going to get feedback, if you know what I mean.
I do. Okay,
Okay.
please do that.
Okay. Apologize for that.
Problem. Go ahead.
So thank you, Chair Bridgman and committee members and staff. I'm speaking today on behalf of the MLA of Friends of Muskoka. I'll be spending my 2 minutes explaining 3 of our suggested changes to how the units are described in the draft OPA. First, we welcomed the announcement in August that the proponent had agreed to reduce the number of units by 299 to a total of 1,700 units. However, we believe the draft does not clearly provide for this reduction and has suggested changes in the markup that we sent to you on Friday. You'll see that section C1433 sets out the number of units allowed on the lands, quote, identified on schedules C and D. And these schedules identify the lands by using slanted lines, according to the legend. So this section should only state the 1,700 units that the proponent is allowed to build and should not include the Marriott or Legacies units. Second, we're disappointed that the entire 299 unit reduction is in the lands off the waterfront west of Jet Haven Road. As we explained to committee in May and August, our community is particularly concerned about built form on the waterfront, and we respectfully ask committee and the proponent to consider splitting the reduction between the waterfront and non-waterfront areas. Finally, we have a new comment since our submission to you on Friday. Our understanding is that 30% of the units on the proponent's waterfront lands, so 30% of the units in the VC, RC1, and RC2 designations may be resort-related residential. But the wording in section C1613 suggests it is 30% of the units in all of Minett, so 30% of the entire 2020 units. This would be a much larger number of resort-related residential units, which we do not believe was intended. We'll send committee Mr. Pink and Mr. McDonald our suggested changes to this section after the meeting. Thank you. Those are my comments, but I did want to just say thank you to Ms. Mortimer for your professionalism and years of wonderful service to the community, and wish you all the best in your retirement, especially with that stiff drink that Mr. Newall mentioned. Thank you.
Oh, okay, thank you. Thank you, Ms. Eplett. All right, we are on to Mr. Potto. Do we bring Mr. Potto in? Good morning, Mr. Potto. I think you're on mute.
Can you hear me, Chair Bridgman?
I can, Mr. Potto. So welcome. And please, we'd love to hear your comments in 2 minutes.
All right,
So please go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. I want to echo the comments of others who said thank you. I think you guys did a lot of work. I think a lot of good work. And I think there's a lot of improvements in this draft. I basically have 3 short comments to make. One is on height, the other is on units, the third is on docking. In terms of height, I respectfully disagree with Ms. Bustard that you should leave this open to whatever architectural details they want, unrestricted. I think you could probably write something tighter than that. But I think in general, buildings in the township have to be under 14 meters. This is 16 meters. I agree with the earlier comments. It should be the lower of 16 meters of the tree line, so you don't end up with something that's 30 meters. So that's my point on height. That's section C1423. On units, I echo the other comments about the unit restriction being split. I think it should be all the units, the 299 reduction should be clear. The 299 unit reduction should be clear. So the maximum of 1,700 units should be made clear. I had said earlier, I think all that reduction should come from the waterfront units, because the way this works is all those residential units, there's no requirement for any of them to be commercial usage. So this resort project, which is supposed to be a commercial resort, is going to end up a majority of residential housing, which is what this is going to end up being. So I had asked for all the units to be reduced on the waterfront. The proponent wants all the units reduced from away from the water. I think a reasonable compromise would be a 50-50 split. I think it'd be much clearer to put those hard caps and spell out those numbers in the document. My third point is on the docking, and it's really a small point, but in section C1 4.46, there's some wording that looks like it was added that says additional dockage may be provided to accommodate transient visitors arriving by water subject to section C1 4.5. I think I understand what you're trying to say there, but I think it would be clearer if you didn't use the word additional dockage, because I think C1 4.5 says there's going to be a limit on dockage. So I wouldn't have this other section talking about additional. And it says it may be provided, whereas the other section says there will be dockage provided for islanders. So I think if you just change that wording to say simply dockage shall be provided, take out the word additional, take out the word may, I think that solves the problem.
Mr. Otto, can you wrap it up very quickly?
Yes, my final point is to Ms. Bustard's comment about the 215. I also would like to see the 215 number specified. I think the solution would be to say that all approved legal units docking is permitted, but any increase beyond 215 units and then go from there. So that way you said that anything legal is allowed, but anything beyond 215 would require further, boat traffic studies, that sort of thing. I think that's a way to solve both issues.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Poto. I think we're at what our limit there, but I think that was the end of what you wanted to say. So
Yes.
Thank you very much for your input. Okay, we're going on to Lisa Van Exen. Welcome, Ms. Van Exen. You could just unmute yourself. Okay, there. I believe you're good now. So if I could just get your name and address before you speak, and then as I've said to everybody, I'm keeping a pretty tight rein on the on this, so I'll give you a 15-second warning before you wrap it up. So please welcome and go ahead.
Thank you very much. My name is Lisa Van Exen, and my address is 1122 Sands Road on Bruce Lake in Minett. I'm a 35-year cottager on Bruce Lake, and I'm here before you this morning on behalf of the Bruce Lake Family Association. Thank you very much for hearing our comments today. Bruce Lake is a small landlocked lake located between Peninsula Road and Judhaven Road in very close proximity to the Rock Golf Course. For context, Bruce Lake is 91 hectares large with a maximum depth of 20 feet compared to Lake Rosso, which is 6,390 hectares large with a maximum depth of about 292 feet. Bruce Lake abuts the lands included in the future development in Minett. The latest OP amendment, which you're considering today, includes many positive revisions, which will result in an overall more sustainable and therefore more successful development, since the natural beauty of the Muskoka is what people come here for and what must be protected. In reviewing OPA 56, it's clear that protecting the water quality and environment was a principal goal and concern throughout this lengthy process. Specifically, Section C 1.2 and Section C 142B, which was touched on by Mr. Newall, talks about future growth within Minett, enhancing the area, and specifically references protecting the water quality of Wallace Bay. It's the request of the Bruce Lake Family Association that, given the proximity of Bruce Lake to the development lands and the overarching goal to protect the existing natural environment, that Bruce Lake be added to Wallace Bay in these two references to protecting water quality. Again, that was Section C 1.2 and C 1.4.2b. The small size of Bruce Lake also impacts its ability to absorb the effects of future development, which in our opinion makes this an even more important reason to specify Bruce Lake in the OPA. I have spoken to both the Planning Department and the MLA about this change. They are both supportive of this request. And as you heard, Mr. Newall and the Royal Muskoka Island has kindly asked for the change as well. we would very much appreciate if you would incorporate this change to protect our small but beautiful lake.
2 minutes exactly. So thank you very much for your input, Ms. Vanixon. Okay, David Straighten.
I'm not sure.
All right, well, let's see who it is. Mr. Straighten. So you don't think he's there now?
No.
Okay, so how about Mr. Beveridge? On the iPad, so, well, let's see. Are we bringing in Mr. or Mrs. iPad? Okay. They're off the screen? Oh, here we go. So whoever's on the iPad, could you lower your screen a little bit? We're looking at the ceiling. And then if you could unmute yourself and just identify yourself, please. So I'm looking to connect with our iPad guest. Mute is on. If you could unmute yourself. Oh, terrific. So may I ask who, we can't actually see, all we see is the top of your head. So may I ask who we're looking at? Hello? Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Who's on the iPad?
Hello?
Hello? Can you hear me? Can you please tell me? We can't see you and we're not quite sure who you are yet. So is this Mr. Beveridge or Dr. Beveridge? Hello? Person on the iPad, could you please tell us who you are? There we go. Okay.
I'm not here.
So, John, is that John?
Yes,
John, I'm sorry, John, but you did not register for this. This is not a public meeting, so you are not going to be able to speak today.
I don't want to speak. I just want to listen.
Oh, a little comic relief is always good, isn't it? All right, we'll put you back out of the meeting then, and you can continue to listen.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Oh, okay. So that now do we have Mr. or Dr. Beveridge here? Do we have anybody else in the waiting room? Okay, so apparently our last person who was on our supplementary agenda is not here. So, all right. Well, then I am going to propose that we turn this back to our committee. And as I suggested in the beginning, I would like to basically go through the notes I made from yesterday on the topics that have been raised. And the first one is the number of units. So I believe that we now understand we're going to get a little more clarification that there has been a reduction in the wording. But I believe the other part that Mr. McDonald will need is that reduction of 299 units. The way it reads now, it is going to be left to, I would expect when the master plan comes in to decide where that unit reduction is. So my question to committee is, are we Are we fine with that? We can leave it till that point in time and have the policy go through as it is now. So do I have any comments? All right, so can I get a nodding of heads then that we're okay with this sitting the way it is at the moment? Well, maybe I better ask for a thumbs up. All right, so Mr. Pink, Madam Clerk, we're good? Okay. Okay, thank you. So the building height is the next one that was that has been raised. It is sitting at 16 meters now. The request is 14 meters from some of our constituents, and from our developer, it's to not only leave it at 16 meters, but also to allow to some variations for what may be the wellness center or the hotel. So I think I'm going to open this up first to the 14 meters or 16 meters, and if anybody has any comments on that. And I think before that, Mr. Pink, would you know how many meters each floor is in the Marriott? Like how high is that Marriott? Do you know? I'm going to ask you to answer that.
Thank you, Chair. Through you, I would certainly have to look into, I perhaps could during the meeting investigate what the height of the JW Marriott is, the maximum height, because I do know it went through a minor variance approval for that height many years ago. What I can comment, just so that everyone is clear, is the zoning bylaw, the maximum permitted height that I'm aware of in the zoning bylaw is 13.7 meters, 45 feet. That is allowed in a number of commercial zones. Most waterfront residential cottages or waterfront residential zones allow a maximum permitted height of 10.7 meters or 35 feet. I just wanted to clarify that because there's been a lot of discussion about precedent or what is currently allowed in the OP. There's nothing in the current OP, but the zoning bylaw does allow those maximums. I would also just note that I see in the waiting room now Massey Beverage, who I believe was a listed delegate, so you may wish to let him speak. And I will investigate the JW.
Okay, thank you. So I see a number of hands. Let's bring in our last delegate before we move on to this. So I believe it's Dr. Beveridge. If you could unmute yourself. Massey, could you unmute yourself? Can you hear me? You just.
Yes, I can hear you. I thought you asked me to mute myself.
Oh, no, you were, no, not at all. Okay, so now we have you here. So please, your name and address before you make your comments. And as with everybody else, I'm keeping everybody pretty well tight to the 2-minute mark. So please go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much. Dr. Massey Beveridge, 1180 Hemlock Point Road, Port Carling, a full-time year-round resident. I think my overarching comment for councillors who have to make difficult decisions about what to approve and what not to are that the real concern for me is noise and boat traffic on the lake. What people do on the back part of their property, whether they have an extra building there, whether they have an extra bunkie, that is much less of a concern to me. I don't mind.
Excuse me, Dr. Beveridge, excuse me, but that none of, I don't believe any of that is what we're dealing with today.
I thought this was a meeting relating to the new
I think you're thinking of the new official plan. This meeting
okay, so this is only Minett.
Minett. So I welcome you to come back again because we will be having a public meeting in terms of the new OP. So we would very much welcome your comments at that point.
Okay, if I could make a brief comment then on Minett, I apologize for coming to the wrong meeting.
Oh, well, you know what? We have so many meetings going on. I understand that. So please go ahead and do make your comments.
So it's largely the same thing, that the concern is the boat traffic on the lake, less so what happens inside from the shoreline. And, you know, nobody, I think, minds folks who are playing tennis or paddle boarding around. It's when every occupant of the new condominium type units arrives with a wakeboard boat and something else. That's what I think we really want to avoid. And I think the idea of, you know, recreational use assessment and so forth is very helpful there. That's the point I wanted to make. Since I didn't have much more prepared, I won't detain council longer.
Thank you very much, Dr. Beveridge, and we look forward to seeing you again at the OP meeting.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Okay. All right. Okay, we'll spend 10 more minutes and then we'll have a comfort break. So Councillor Kelly.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and through you. On the building height issue, before we get to 16 versus 14, the other limiting factor here is something called existing mature tree canopy. And I don't really think I know what that means. I don't know whether that's an average of measured tree height. I don't know whether that changes or whether that's measured today because it says present, I believe, existing. I don't know whether that's something you measure after it's been prepared for construction. So my issue there is if that's going to have any meaning, I got to understand it a little bit better. How is it measured? When is it measured? And how is it sort of recorded?
Okay, so Mr. McDonald, you give us your thoughts on that?
Certainly, Chair Bridgman, great question. Existing mature tree canopy is what it is at the time any plan is drawn up to show where higher buildings are. The location of the tree canopy and its height is also a consideration. Very, very challenging to define this in an official plan, even more challenging in a zoning bylaw. That's why we've included a provision in here that requires a master height plan be submitted as part of the master planning process. Very challenging to do this in advance. So what this policy is saying is that in no case can it be higher than 16 meters. I know it has the word or the existing mature tree canopy. That's not intended to allow it to go beyond. But issues of where high buildings are in relation to the tree canopy is not a decision we can make through this OP process. It is only a decision that can be looked at in some detail through the implementation. So the wording is, it is what it is in terms of it being the existing tree canopy at the time. And we will have to look at that in some detail when the actual site plan and zoning application is made. I don't know if that's helpful or not, but we're really getting into some very detailed discussion on design, and it's very challenging to do in an official plan context.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry,
Mayor
just as
oh,
sorry, just
sorry,
a quick,
yeah, a supplemental. Go ahead.
Yeah, just supplemental, and thank you for that, Mr. McDonald. My issue really is one of timing. If you measure the tree canopy before site preparation takes place, it's going to look a lot different. And you could measure it today and have a glorious, large, high tree canopy, and at the end of the day, have 8 buildings sticking up out of a desert. So I'm just trying to figure out when the relevant measurement is taken.
Okay, yeah, Mayor Harding.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I guess my concern, nobody wants a JW Marriott with buildings of any height far in excess of a tree canopy, which is what I believe has happened there. the words in the official plan for me that talk about tree canopy and well underneath tree canopy, I think cover us off in that. I do respect the perspective of 16 meters, but again, we've heard potentially that a wellness center or some other component of this element of this building might fit to go to 16.5 with mechanicals on the roof or whatever. And I love Mr. McDonald's concept about a master height plan that deals with everything in a zoning bylaw. And I'm wondering whether we've become so prescriptive here in trying to give them a little bit extra with 16 meters that we're actually sometimes maybe throwing the baby out with the bathwater, and that it is more appropriate to be dealing with in a zoning bylaw or a master plan as we go forward. A zoning bylaw is specific at a height. We do occasionally on individual people's properties come in here with exemptions to height because of a cum lot or something going on top, cupola, excuse me, on top of the roof. And who knows exactly what this is going to be. For myself, I think well below the tree canopy is totally appropriate. And I might want to see a 17-meter unique bell tower, something built there from a design perspective, well beneath the tree canopy. If you think of where Wallace Marina is, you could tuck that well into there and not see anything. So I'm not sure whether being as so prescriptive in the OP, I would rather see us really refine this whole development in some aspects on the master servicing plan or the zoning bylaw.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Nishikawa.
Thank you. So I don't know the meters, but I recall when we approved the Marriott way back when that we were talking about 70 feet. And it was very interesting. Again, the conversation was not 70 feet from the entrance that we all know the entrance of the building, but it was in fact the lowest point, the lowest door of the whole building. That could be a service entrance, for instance. It could be a lot of things. So I find it very challenging to nail down what the height would be on a structure without actually knowing. I would hate that we would be limiting some very creative, unique architecture that could and should be coming to Muskoka Lakes. We all talk about our boathouses are all just cake boxes, you know, more or less. I really, and I would also say recently, within the last couple of years, there have been some really interesting designs. A boathouse and a very low scaled roof design on a cottage that really impressed me, and I don't see enough of that. So I am really challenged for trying to nail down what this height is today without actually knowing what we have the option for. We know that, for instance, those features, and I will just use when we had an application in Bala, and there was a very unique piece to a senior complex, that a tower, please, which was ultimately going to be all glass, but you know, we all see those same types of things in hospitals and things. Well, we chopped that out of the plan. It wasn't a huge thing, but it was going to be exceeding the height, and that's a shame to me. So I hope that we can have a little bit more leeway at this point, because I don't think that we can just nail down a number today without actually seeing the landscape that goes around it. Because again, we're measuring from that lowest point, and it could be just that one service door that it gets measured from, and not knowing all of the other landscaping that goes with it. I'd be challenged to nail down a number today. Thank you.
Councillor Edwards.
Yes, thank you very much. I guess I'd like to know the heights of Cleveland House now existing. They would have a grandfather if they wanted to build the same. I don't have a problem with 16 meters at 52 feet. And, you know, if you look at the JW Marriott, it's above some of the trees because it's built on a hill and the trees are below it. If you look at from the lake. So the further out that you get, the more prominent it becomes. So I think there is something to the tree heights. I've had a lot of people comment on the JW Marriott. When you're there, it's a beautiful building, but from the towards the bottom end of the lake, it really sticks out. So I would be very, very careful on that. And they can always ask for an exemption if it's one building or two. So I could live with 16 meters. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor Harding.
Thank you. I'm not sure trying to move this as a method forward because again, we've heard some people want to lower this to 14 from a owner of the property perspective. They'd like it to be higher. We know that, or do we allow some exemptions? Maybe Mr. Pink or Mr. McDonald can help. In our current official plan, we know our zoning bylaw for lot coverage on residential lot contemplates a 10%, and that's the guideline within our zoning bylaw. However, we do in our official plan allow for that to go up to 11% lot coverage, which gets people in and around that. And I'm wondering whether or not there's an opportunity in this policy to state something along the line of 16 meters, but to allow the developer some flexibility to allow in certain instances without having to come for an official plan amendment, that the policy could allow for exceptions and call them strictly exceptions up to a 10 or 20% expansion to that within limited areas as defined by the zoning bylaw and height. I'm just trying to think of a path forward that would be palatable, that provides a direction.
Mr. McDonald.
Through you, Chair Bridgman, currently the way the policy is written, it wouldn't allow for an increase in height in a future zoning bylaw amendment process or even through a minor variance. It's just the way it's written. But certainly I would be open to incorporating some language that allows for variances similar to what you've suggested already applies in other parts of the township. So with that direction, I'm happy to include that.
Okay, so I'm going to look for input on that. I think that may be a way to go forward because again, the master plans are really going to I think Councillor Nishikawa's point, until you see what's going to be there, it's very hard to nail down a number. Councillor Edwards?
The thing is this, if you say 16 meters and you allow a percentage, say it's another 2 meters, it's like in that committee of adjustment on a 10%, they know they're going to get 11, so they come in with 11. I'd leave it at the 16, do it through a site plan. At that time, there could be an exemption, but you might as well say whatever it is, that's it. So I would say no to allowing any increase. We've already gone up from 45 to 52 feet. So I leave it at that. Thank you.
Mr. McDonald, could you just clarify for me, if we leave it as it's written now, my assumption is there are no exceptions. Am I interpreting that properly?
No, that's correct, Chair Bridgman. It's written as a lot of this official plan is written, it is definitive. So that's exactly what it says. And so no minor variance could be considered. And even if through the master planning process, something looked great, but it was higher than 16 meters, you'd have to amend the official plan to implement that.
Okay, I just wanted to clarify that and clarify it for you too, Councillor Edwards, so that we've all got that. Councillor Kelly.
Thank you, and through you, I'm just concerned that when we start leaving discretion and leaving things sort of open and somewhat vague, we risk the kinds of results we've had at LPAT in the past. If it's not specific, it's, to my way of thinking, it's not really enforceable.
Thank you. Mr. Pink would like to speak to this.
Thank you, through you, the chair. It was just in response to your earlier question on the heights. I did research the building. the JW Marriott, just so that I think people can have some perspective. There was a 2003 zoning bylaw amendment that allowed the JW Marriott at 60 feet in height. There was a subsequent minor variance. For those familiar with the building or the property, the Peyton House building is down lower. The JW Marriott building is up higher, and the variance allowed the height measurement to be calculated separately, which I think Member Nishikawa was referring to as to typically the zoning bylaw would measure from the lowest finished grade to the peak. So that variance did allow that to be separate. And then in 07, subsequently, there was a minor variance that did allow 63 feet, 10 inches. That's the top of the tower of the JW Marriott. That went to the OMB, and it looks like the evidence given was that the majority, about 80% of the building is about 50 feet tall, but that 20% tower goes to 63 feet, 10 inches. Just lastly, to clarify some of the discussion, I don't believe Ms. Bustard was implying that discretion be given over the 16 meters to the bulk of Minett. I think what Mr. McDonald and I could quite easily do is continue to restrict the height limitation to 16 meters or 14 meters, depending on the direction of committee, but to allow perhaps without the need for an official plan amendment, that an icon building or two be permitted to be considered to go above that as it goes through a zoning exercise or a master height planning exercise. So it allows that ability to review a taller building or two. Will need future council approval, but it would not be across Minett. So I just wanted to clarify, I don't believe there was ever any direct request to allow over 16 meters for residential uses or other smaller buildings throughout Minett. It was just, I believe in Ms. Bustard's submission, it was the wellness center in particular, and perhaps a hotel building. So that's something easily Mr. McDonald and I believe we can do. But again, look to committee's discussion and direction in that regard.
Thank you. Mayor Harding?
I'm in support of that 100% and would love to see that language coming back direct to council.
Okay, I agree. So now, can I get a show of thumbs if we're in agreement with that? So that's Madam Clerk, Mr. Pink. Okay, great. All right, I am going to, let's take a 10-minute break and we'll come back at 11:15. Oh, Councillor Mazan, is your hand doing funny things again?
Yes, that was my iPad. Sorry about that. Thank you.
It's okay. All right, we'll see you back in 10. Oh, Councillor Nishikawa, sorry, missing that.
Sorry, I realized that we did a thumbs up, but I don't believe that we did a thumbs up for a number. We liked the concept, but we actually didn't nail a number down. And so I would say, for instance, I would throw out the 16, but we haven't nailed down a number.
I'm sorry. I guess I assumed because the 16 is in there now, that was what we were going to go with. So Councillor Roberts?
I apologize. I'm working on a new device today, so I'm trying to figure where everything is. Another point is I'd like to get back to Councillor Kelly. A point that kind of on the tree canopy. When is it set? Before lot clearing or after lot clearing? So I just want clarification on that. Thank you.
I don't believe that's part of the OP. Mr. McDonald?
Yeah, through you, Chair Bridgman, that's not really specified in the official plan. I think conceptually it would be at the time the application is made and everything is being looked at holistically. I haven't heard of any desire to go out and clear everything out and then start fresh. That isn't part of the plan as far as I can tell and know, and that can certainly be confirmed. But the point in time would be when the application is made and everything is looked at holistically.
Supplemental comment?
Yes, you can.
Yeah, basically then it's wide open. Basically, you know, whatever happens, you know, developers do not have to state their full plans up front. So whatever they need, they can do. So I'm just, that's my concern.
Councillor Edwards.
Yes, if we can make exceptions for a hotel or a wellness center or something like that, I'd leave it at the existing 14 feet for the rest of the buildings. And that then you're in sync with the rest of the township, which is, I think, what it should be. Thank you.
Okay, so I think we've got the exceptions going. Now we're down to whether it's 14 meters or 16 meters. So could I have thumbs up for 14 meters? Who would like to keep it at 14? I see 4. Yeah, you're 4. And who would like to keep it at 16? What's that? No, that's her magic hand. Just,
Actually, in this particular case, it's not my magic.
oh,
hand.
it's not. Okay.
I think just because of the importance of this, I want to be sure I'm clear exactly on the options on the table here. So if it was 14 meters across the board, as it relates to residential in particular, is it residential? I guess I was seeking clarity from Director Pink's comments earlier, where he noted that residential, actually the height permitted is 35 feet and commercial is 45 feet. And looking at all these different zones, now we're saying we can go up to 45 feet. Is that correct for 14 meters and or 52 feet at 16 meters across the board? And that then the exceptions, so if it was 14 feet, sorry, I'm not being clear at all here, but that's why I want to be sure I'm clear. If it was 14 meters across the board, this new language would allow for the variances that I think I heard Ms. Bustard was asking for. Is that correct?
Director Pink?
I think what's might be confusing a little bit is typically these finer details are prescribed in the zoning bylaw, and you wouldn't in an official plan be this detailed and stipulate a height for every zone and every building. I think the way the policies are currently written, it would allow a maximum height of 16 meters in Minett. That may be further prescribed in the zoning bylaw to stipulate 35 feet in residential areas, 45 feet in commercial areas. I believe what we do have direction, and I did see a number of thumbs up, is agreement to amend the policy to allow consideration of 1 or 2 icon buildings to exceed 16 meters through future council approval. So that would avoid the need for an OPA. I believe now what we're discussing is whether that maximum permitted sort of broad umbrella height across Minett is either going to be 14 meters or 16 meters. Again, I can clarify that in most waterfront residential zones, the maximum height is 35 feet. That's actually 10.7 meters. The maximum height in most waterfront commercial zones is 13.7 meters or 45 feet. And I believe that's the maximum permitted height as of right in our zoning bylaw in any zone is 45 feet, 13.7 meters. And again, that's just for clarity of what our current zoning bylaw says. I see Mr. McDonald.
Could I have a quick supplemental then? If it was oh, sorry, go on.
I'm sorry. I thought Mr. McDonald wanted to just comment before you ask your supplemental, Councillor Mazan.
Thank you very much, Chair Bridgman. I just wanted to add another element into this. And based on my experience and given the cost of construction, 5-story buildings are way more economical and cost effective to build. And the lower we make the height, the less economical it is to actually build. And I'm very concerned that the proponent is not going to be satisfied with a lower height, and we may end up with another issue. So I want to make sure we think through this very carefully. I think the 16 meters is a good top end. And if we allow for some flexibility, that's great. It doesn't mean it'll be 16 meters across the whole site. And keep in mind that this council, if it is this council and not the next, I'm not sure, depending on when the application is made, all of those very detailed decisions on where the higher buildings are going to be located have to be made in advance before anything occurs. So there is quite a few checks and balances in the policy framework to allow for this decision making to happen at a later stage. So I just wanted to throw that out there. I'm a little concerned about being overly prescriptive here.
Supplemental, Councillor Mazan?
Actually, if I could ask, if I could come back, I think I just need to think about what was just said, and it looks like a few other hands are up. So thank you.
Okay, Councillor Jaglowitz?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I'm supportive of what's being proposed, and I'll tell you why, and maybe council could keep in mind what we're approving here is a commercial development. We're not approving a residential subdivision. The residential component, resort-related residential component that's going to be near the waterfront is intended to be an integral part of the resort. So we shouldn't see a commercial building and a residential building. We should see it all together. The residential part is back on the other side of Peninsula Road. And therefore, I believe that we have to look at this on the waterfront as a commercial development. And I think what's proposed here is likely appropriate. Thank you.
Okay, Mayor Harding.
Thank you. I'd echo Councillor Jagwood's comments that I think the 16 is appropriate right now. We've circulated 16. We've been talking about 16. We are talking about a higher level official plan. For those who have not sat around here and had to go through a zoning bylaw for extensive developments, it is extensive. And we do have an ability to input other changes and other tweaks, and the height plan and the master servicing plan is where we get into that. I know Councillor Nishikawa, Councillor Edwards, and myself would all too remember that of Hannah's Landing and going through that zoning amendment and that zoning plan for heights and knolls and grassy areas. So this is just the starting point. Again, we've circulated 16 meters. Let's move this forward. If the public are really upset with that coming to council, they can lobby us at that point, and maybe Ms. Bustard can also comment on her perspective. But let's, I believe, move this forward.
Yes, I was just going to say, can we now reconfirm, just now that we're all clear, it would be 16 meters with some exceptions, maybe one or two iconic buildings. So are we good with that again? Okay, Madam Clerk, Mr. Pink, we're good. All right. So now we're going to take a 10-minute break and come back at 5 to 11. Well, I just had a great conversation with myself. So- not everybody's back yet, so we're going to have to wait for quorum.
They're back with everyone.
Yes, so see if I can remember what I just said for 2 minutes on mute. We'll see. Okay.
Chair Bridgman, could I just add, I did want to note that I was kicked out after that last part of the discussion and I've had an update, but I just wanted to let you know I wasn't part of that tail end. Technology had a chance to kick me out. I don't believe I need a supplemental, but I just wanted it noted because I wasn't sure where if procedurally that needed to be noted. Thank you.
Oh, okay, thanks. All right, so you know that we did our vote on that 16 meters with some exceptions, Councillor Mazan. We're going ahead with that.
Thank you.
Okay. Okay, all right, so now we're going to move on to docking. And I know the request has been 215 spots, but you know, what is a slip? Because we now have 30-foot boats and we have 10-foot boats. So I actually really like what's in there now, but I think what we really need to do is just clarify what is legal and existing now so that everybody actually understands that. So I'm going to ask Director Pink to sort of go through the different properties and speak to that. Director Pink?
Thank you, Chair, through you. I do, I guess from the onset, would note that both several speakers, including the principal stakeholder and several groups from the public, requested that the unit or a boat slip count be reinserted back into the draft. I just want to refresh committee's memory that there was direction at the last meeting for staff and Mr. McDonald not to do that. And to just refer to legally existing or approved docks. So I have not field truthed the number of docks in Minett, but I did want to state that it's, just so that committee's clear, it's not an exact science. It's quite different than calculating, let's say, parking spaces in a strip mall or a parking lot, where parking spaces are clearly delineated and driveway widths can be clearly measured. With boat slips, it's not an exact science. Obviously, there are parts of the water body or docks that you wouldn't be able to access. There may be water depth issues. There's obviously very different sizes of boats, and there's very different, all kinds of dock configurations out there. And it's not as easy as just adding up every 20 feet of dock spaces. You may not be able to necessarily access it. So personally, I think the way the draft is written works quite well in that instead of creating an administrative sort of headache or difficulty in having a constant tally or understanding of the number of boat slips in all of Wallace Bay, it's quite clear that any future increase will trigger some further review and obviously needed council approval. So I did want to clarify that just to provide some background. Again, there was a few submissions that looked to reinsert the 215 number. And again, just to clarify the difficulty in that, I don't believe 215 is correct. I might look to the mayor, Your Worship. I know you were on the working group and that number was thrown around and I think came up during those discussions, but I don't believe it was ever really investigated as to whether that was the correct number. For example, most of the properties in Minett have had relatively recent planning approvals, and it's fairly easy to calculate the number of permitted or approved boat slips on those properties. For example, the Wallace Marine property is the large one. I believe there have been building permits issued for about 60 slips, and there's a hold on about 90 slips that have yet, that hold is yet to be lifted, and therefore building permit issued. But that would add up to 150 right there. The JW Marriott received zoning approval in about 2008 for some docks to exceed width and length, and I believe they add up to about 45, as does the legacy site plan. It's about 45, 50 slips on that site plan that I think most people are familiar with. And Cleveland's House is the difficult property. There hasn't really been any building or planning approval for many, many years, but there was an amendment in 1998. It did allow a small dock addition to exceed length. And it appears, based on that, the permanent dock that's currently in place, that would be legal. It exceeds, it has quite a substantial length, I think well over 200 feet in length. And a small addition was legally permitted in '98. What we discovered through air photos is that an extensive amount of additional floating docks have been placed there since that time. I see no record of a further zoning approval or a building permit, so it's likely that those docks are not legal. But if you add up those numbers that I just went over, of those clearly permitted or currently existing or definitely approved, you're looking at closer to 260 to 270 boat slips in Minett. So therein lies the difficulty with the desire to just say 215 or whatever the number is. I think the much simpler way is what is there, or what's been approved is what it is. But going forward, any future changes that would increase docking or boat slips in Wallace Bay will necessitate some further review and study, and that's how the current policies are drafted. And I think that, in my opinion, certainly simplifies it, but I am open to, again, hearing from those speakers as to why the desire to put that number in. I don't believe their submissions really detail why, other than a request to add that number in. I don't know if Mr. McDonald wishes to add anything on those comments, but I hope that background is of assistance, and I'm available to answer any questions.
Mr. McDonald, would you like to?
Nothing to add on my end. I think that makes eminent sense. And David and I did talk about that before the last meeting, and we both agreed that was the right approach.
Okay, so certainly from my end, being close to there, from a visual standpoint, I now understand that everything that is there, and in Cleveland's house, it's just that permanent long end of the dock and the very small part for the ski school that was approved a long time ago. So that's it, except for the 90 on hold from in the marina area. Those are everything that's legal at this point. So Legacy's building theirs. Marriott has theirs. The Cleveland dock stays as it is, and there's more slips at SWS, and that's it. So Councillor Zaglowitz? You just put yourself on mute, Frank.
Thank you. I guess I didn't unmute. Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Thank you, Chair. Possibly this falls in the same category, just needs a clarification, as when we were talking about the unit count of 2020. In going back and reading it, I see that it does refer to the schedule, but it should maybe make it clear that it's all of Minett. And in this case, I was thinking of docks in Wallace Bay. I don't think of Legacy being in Wallace Bay, but if I understand it, that we're talking about all the docks in what's defined as Minett, which includes Legacy and would include Paul Richards docks and other things like that. So maybe that's, David, how you get to that 260 or 70. So maybe that just has to be clarified there, that that's what that means. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Savitz.
Thank you, and through you. I guess my first part of my two questions, if I might, to David, are what I just heard, are the floating finger docks at the existing Cleveland's property, are they coming out? Are they going away? They're not permitted? Am I hearing that, or are they there as of right because they've been there forever? So David, you weren't clear on that, if you might.
Mr. Pink?
That would be a bylaw enforcement matter. I think we would have to probably consult with legal counsel, given how long they've probably been there and given the statute of limitations. So we would have to investigate that. To be, I guess, somewhat blunt or honest, I'm hopeful through the redevelopment and the process we're going through that likely that docking will change and that will likely address itself. But whether the municipality pursues the removal of those docks, that's an enforcement matter that I will follow through with bylaw enforcement staff as to our options available to us.
Okay, thank you. And I guess to that end, I certainly support your comments and Nick's as it relates to your recommendation. So thank you.
Okay, Mayor Harding.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I guess my question, and as we do move this forward, I think there is confusion on what's Cleveland's House lands, what's Legacy lands, what's JW Marriott. So I think it would be appropriate for staff to kind of bring back and understand what's currently built, what's permitted to be built. And I think that's ultimately what we're trying to do, is what's permitted to be built. We're not expanding any more permits to build anything at this particular time. So I think that clarification can come back through staff going forward. If it needs to be a number on the Cleveland's House, then I think my gut is that's exactly what Mr. Goldhar was asking for, just to ensure that number on his property doesn't get shrunk or not, or anything along the way. So I'm happy to let staff chime back in.
Okay, Councillor Kelly.
Thank you, through you. Just, I guess I'm trying to make sure I understand we've got this in the right order. Is the number of docks, certainly the docks that are available for public use, going to depend on the public access to the property? If they're, we heard the proponent delegate that there should be no public access, or that could be a big issue. If that in fact happens, it seems to me, since much of these docks are dedicated to the use of the public, that the need for those docks goes away.
I'm not sure if that's a question or not, Councillor Kelly. The docks at Cleveland's House, those floating docks that were added over the last few years.
Yeah.
Is that what you're talking about? Those are the ones
I'm just talking about generally the docks in this development, the dock space. It seems to me, and I can't find it, I wish I could, that there was only a certain percentage, I believe it was 10% that were to be reserved for the use of unit owners. And if the proponent's wish is that there's not public access to all or certain parts of this property, to Lake Rosso through this property, then is there a need for all this dock space for the public to come in and tie up? What do they do when they get there?
Well, I'm hoping Abby's is open again, but that's just my personal comment. I'm not sure where to go with that. It's 10% of what's available now. So are you suggesting that there'll be even more if the public is allowed in? I'm sorry, I'm not. I mean, if
no, I'm assuming that the discussion we're having now centers around whatever the number of dock spaces, and I agree that it's impossible to count them. However many feet of docking there is in some way connected to the fact that the public will come in, tie up, and have access to the property. And if I'm hearing correctly, and that's not the desire of the developer, then presumably not all of the dock space all of that number of feet of dock space is necessary.
okay, I don't know if anybody wants to.
Yeah, Chair Bridgman,
okay, Mr. McDonald?
I can take a crack at it. I think what the proponent was talking about were the policies that we added regarding public access, generally speaking. And I did review all of those references, and they basically all say collectively that if there's an opportunity to secure public access through the process of development, that would be great. But we're not going to make it happen wherever it can't happen. So it's a completely different issue. I certainly see the docks being used by the public to access the wellness center, the hotel, the restaurants on the site. I don't see that ever changing. So I think we're having two different discussions that don't really relate to each other. So again, I think what we're trying to figure out is, should we stay the course with how the draft is written now, cap what's there, everything else requires a study, or do we come up with a number? I certainly recommend the former.
Okay, so could I suggest that we leave it as it is now? And as Mayor Harding said, perhaps we can get Director Pink to come back to us at council with a fairly accurate count, or more than accurate, with definitively what docks are there now, so that we all understand that. Councillor Edwards?
Thank you. I don't know if this is relevant at this time, but when you're saying about public access and that to the property, if they do residential on the other side of District Road 28, will these people not have access? And this is a concern. So you build all these houses on the other side, and you're saying, well, no, our resort is private. This is what I was reading from the Paula's statement there. For 150 years, it's been private. So what are those people going to do? They're going to have to go down to, say, Hannah Park or something like that for access. And that this is a concern. And that, what about if we put staff housing in? Will they be allowed to use this? And that we've got to get that cleared up, because it is a real concern on that. And I have some other issues, but I will go over that when the time comes. Thank you.
Well, I'm going to guess, because it's one resort property, that any house on that resort has access to the water. But that's just my guess. I'm not sure that, again, that's part of the OP. Mr. McDonald, where would some of those questions come in?
Yeah, so good point. I think the key principle here is that there is not to be any additional docking permitted unless a study is done. Principle number one. Principle number two is that no matter what happens, no more than 10% of the docks are to be reserved for unit owners. The idea here is that people aren't going to be buying units and bringing boats up. That just is not going to be possible, right? So those are the two principles we're working with here. And if it wasn't that way, then there would be many hundreds of docks being desired in this area, and that's not what anybody wants. So that's what we're working with here.
Okay, so maybe I could go back again. My suggestion is that we leave the wording as is, and that Mr. Pink can come back to us when this moves on to council to define actually what is legal and what is there now and what will be built, and we can have a look at it there. So do I have agreement on that? Okay. Madam Clerk, Mr. Pink? All right. So the next one I'm looking at is the on-site staffing, but Mr. McDonald, you had already indicated you're going to tighten that up for us. And so in terms of municipal services, I'm not sure that there is anything to discuss here. Anybody, Councillor Edwards?
Yes, I am concerned about the services, because with this, residents that already have their own water and septic system with the district will be forced onto this system. That's a cost that they're going to have to bear, and I don't think that's right. And that when we put something in, it's different if you live in Bracebridge or somewhere there's services now and hook up. If there's new services, why should, and because it could be $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 for these people to hook up. Is the developer going to hook them up for them as they go by? And that because I look at and that Mr. Richardson, he would be forced to hook up to the system, and I don't think that's right at this time. And that's so that I'd like a clarification on that. I've been saying in the Bracebridge area and that if a septic system is operable and it's safe, and they don't have to hook up until they have to replace it. But still, that's going to put a future cost on to somebody that's private. And I just wonder how we're going to get around that. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to ask Mr. Pink to clarify the district's policies on this. But the other thought, Councillor Edwards, is if that's the case, the Marriott now has a private system, Legacy now has a private system, they would not be required to hook up either. So I just wanted to point that out to you. Oh, I did. I think Mayor Harding, Mayor Harding is going to speak to this, seeing as it's his committee at district.
Thank you, Chair Bridgman. I'm sure that Director Pink can also chime in on this. There is a policy within the district. The idea is we have a number of properties that are abutting municipal services that have not hooked up. So there is a new mandatory connection bylaw that came into effect in 2021. It got updated again. Sorry, it's been up in for a while, but it got updated in 2021. That would provide exemptions for people who have recently redone their sewage system and their own private system to move forward. As well, there are also, if the costs are to exceed a certain amount of money, there are provisions for a committee at the district to provide extensions up to 10 years. The idea being, and again, another extension, within 20 years, most existing systems would have to be upgraded and changed. So at one point, we want to get everybody onto our own systems. So any new system going in would kick a trigger, but basically you've got about a decade. And again, you can have some extensions to that. So anybody who, Mr. Richards in particular, would have at least 10 years before we would have to upgrade or connect. The legacy, because it was built already, would have at minimum a 10-year window before they would have to connect. Now, there is provisions incidentally in our bylaw that we will and can force the Marriott commercial to upgrade and to connect right away, knowing that they've been around with their system for over a decade now. We would be able to mandate that they do connect in, because the more users of the system, the better the system is going to work. So I think we've already got provisions within the district mandatory connection bylaw that will protect those residents who will be theoretically forced to hook up. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Councillor Jaglowitz.
Thank you, Chair. Actually, I was going to bring up the same subject, but I have a slightly different perspective on it. When we look at the services and in the full service area, we have the Marriott, and I believe there are agreements in place there that have to be worked out. So I think that will work itself out. I think Mr. Richards is an isolated case, and I heard somewhere that that was going to be dealt with. So I'm comfortable that will be dealt with and should be dealt with. But when it comes to legacy, I have a concern, and I think we may need some legal advice on this. This council, not the one sitting on it now, but the one before us, granted the right to legacy to build their resort on communal private services. And this particular OP amendment appears to force them into connection. Now, I know the mayor has said there are policies at the district that they may not have to, but those policies can be changed and so on. So I feel a little uncomfortable not having a legal opinion as to what actually is going on there. And I think you're all aware this change is just recent, and I believe there's some correspondence from someone representing legacy who have raised are not represented here today, and that concerns me also. So I think this matter needs to be looked at, and I'm not trying to say it goes one way or the other. I just think that put yourself in the position of legacy, who have just spent a lot of money to put in services that are apparently ministry approved, and now they're being forced to connect in another way. So anyway, that's my comment.
So Councillor Jaglowitz, but they will have the same grace period, I believe, as Mr. Richards on that. So just comment there. So
supplementary, sorry. I'm not so sure. I think when the mayor speaks about a policy of the district, that's a policy for residential uses. I don't know what will happen there. I just think we just have to be careful. That's all I'm asking, is just that we and I don't want to mention why I'm saying we have other matters outstanding with legacy that we should be careful on, in my view anyway. Thank you.
Okay, so it may be worth having our legal counsel look at that, Mr. Pink. That's okay. Do you want to talk? Oh, okay. Mr. Pink?
Just very quickly, and I note Mr. McDonald, I think, wanted to say some words as well, but there's a couple of things I wanted to point out. One, we did speak with the representative of Legacy Cottages to advise them of the servicing schedule, and he raised no concerns with that approach, though he was not in attendance today. The other thing that I would note is that municipal services is a district responsibility, and it was intentional, the way the current draft has been prepared on the township level, that the servicing map is an appendix. And the recommendation includes a request that the District of Muskoka include a servicing schedule. That is their responsibility, and they will review the proposed services and work with those landowners to determine the appropriate location of any pipes and the schedule as to who and when should hook up. So just wanted to point those two out, although if the direction is, I'm happy to get a legal opinion if that is the direction of committee. But I did want to point out that it is an appendix in this draft. And again, Mr. McDonald, I think maybe wanted to add to that.
Mr. McDonald?
Through you, Chair Bridgman. I guess the other practical part of this is that the services are there. They were built by the developer, and the cost of each of the units factors in those services. And by the time services are actually developed in Minett and this 10-year period occurs, the services will be owned by the plan of condominium, not the developer. I'm reasonably certain that the plan of condominium and the condominium board would be very happy to not be responsible for services and would be more than happy to pay for services to be provided by the district. I think it makes eminent sense over the longer term. It's also much more supportive of the environment and protecting the environment in general. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mayor Hardy.
Thank you. And I would agree with Mr. McDonald on that. Whenever I've had to deal with it, they all will embrace quickly hooking up to the system. To Councillor Jagwood's comment, our mandatory connection bylaw does not differentiate residential versus commercial. It actually even does speak where any house or building or structure used for human occupancy, employment, recreation, or other purposes. So it does encapsulate all structures and buildings that are hooked up to private services that are abutting municipal services. So, but again, open to amendment as a district servicing plan as recommended by Mr. McDonald is appropriate.
Councillor Jaglowitz.
Yeah, just so it's perfectly clear before we leave this subject, then what's being said to me is that nobody this OPA is not forcing anybody to hook into these municipal services, even though it says they're in the full service area and it's mandatory to connect. It's not mandatory in our OPA. It's up to the district to work something out with them, and that would include the Marriott also. So there's nothing in this OPA forcing the Marriott to connect. It's up to their negotiation with the district. That's the interpretation, even though I believe this OPA says something different. And if that's the case, then I'm comfortable. Thank you.
Mr. McDonald, would you like to verify that?
Yeah. Yes, from a practical perspective, that's exactly how it's going to work.
Okay, so can I get a thumbs up on the servicing? All right, we're good. Yes, I'm sorry. Yes, as is. Carries forward as is. I'm sorry, clarity that so Mr. Pink.
Just so that we're perfectly abundant, because when this does come back in a few weeks, we want to make sure it's as precisely as committee directs. No changes to the servicing policies other than we can add clarification that as to who is responsible for the costs of installation to make it clear. I believe there was general consensus around that. If you recall the delegation from Mr. Richards, certainly was not the intent to require Mr. Richards to pay for the capital costs of installing the sewer and water treatment plants. So we can make that clear.
Yeah, that would be any private owner.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. All right, I think we're good with that. All right, so I am looking now at the resort commercial accommodation unit use provisions that Mr. Newall brought up. His concern was that it says individually. So Mr. Pink and I had a discussion about this. So I think it's clear, it's certainly clearer for me what that is. And I don't know, Mr. McDonald or Mr. Pink, if you would like to explain that this is really talking about condominium agreements. I don't. Okay, Mr. McDonald or Mr. Pink.
So I'll start. So yes, this really is intended to apply to condominium agreements. We do expect and anticipate that much of the development will occur by plan of condominiums. So that's how it was written. I don't know, Mr. Pink, if you want to add to that.
Mr. Pink. Okay, so I think my confusion also with this is, so it means that the individual unit in any condominium, and so the definition of an individual covers the trust, the partnerships, the whatever. I think that's the part that was not very clear, Mr. McDonald.
No, and I understand that, and I'm happy to take another look at it. Essentially, it was intended to cover any circumstance where it's not a single ownership, really. So a single ownership hotel has its own set of rules, and when it's not a single ownership hotel or resort, then these rules kick in. So I'm happy to finesse the wording to make that 100% clear, but I do anticipate most, if not all, development to occur through the plan of condominium process. It's the easiest way to transfer ownership, and it's much more flexible to allow for lots of different things to happen.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Jaglowitz.
Thank you, Chair. Are we discussing the 30% part of this, or just is that coming up later, Chair Bridgman? You're just talking about the resort-related residential units. Are we talking about the 30%?
Not at the moment, Councillor Jaglowitz. I wouldn't mind getting through my list, and then I'll open it up.
So could you add it to the end of your list? Then I'll just comment on Mr. McDonald's concept that he anticipates most of these units taking place by condominium. That may not occur. There's nothing in this that says they have to be condominium units. And I believe the proponent has indicated that he intends to retain ownership of most of it. So would that change anything if in fact there was not a condominium corporation, but they remained with the proponent?
Mr. McDonald?
I think if the units remain with the proponent, then by definition, they're commercial 100% of the time, because they're not being sold to any individual who may want to use the unit for their own purposes. So if the proponent retains ownership, then it's clearly commercial, and they would do everything in their power to make sure those units are rented out to get that revenue stream. That's just what would happen practically. What we're talking about here is what happens if they're sold individually, and what the rules would be in that circumstance. Either way works. Certainly, we prefer single ownership and owned by the proponent, because there would be a motivation to see revenue coming in through the rental of those units.
Thank you.
Thank you. So that's great. You just maybe massage your wording a little bit, Mr. McDonald. That'll be great. Going to go on to Mr. Newell's point about recreational and other amenities, just adding in that are waterfront related. So does anybody have any comments on that? Do we all like it? So I would be in favor of that. Who's in favor of that? All right, Madam Clerk. It would be C1.5.4.4 and C1.5.4.5. For only recreational and other amenities, we are going to add on to that to that are waterfront related. Mr.
Can I make a
Pinker?
comment, Chair Bridgman, on that
Yes.
particular point?
Mr. McDonald?
Yes, sorry about that. Sorry to interject, but I just want to, before we get too far down this path, I want to make sure we're not creating a problem that we're not intending. Someone could argue a wellness center is not waterfront related. So I want to make sure we understand what we're talking about here. The point what I did in the amendment was to make sure it's not resort or residential. Fair enough. So it's recreational and other amenities, which in my view includes a wellness center. And I'm aware that there are some folks that don't think a wellness center is appropriate on the waterfront. So that's a bigger conversation than just changing the wording here. Just want to put that out there.
Thank you for that. So what you're really saying is that a wellness center that doesn't satisfy the proper setbacks.
That's correct. So I was okay with the idea of there being a wellness center on the waterfront that's part of the proponent's vision. But if you insert wording saying it has to be waterfront related, I'm sure someone's going to say a wellness center is not waterfront related. That's where I'm getting to.
Okay, do we have any comments on that? Mayor Harding.
If I'm not mistaken, Mr. Newell's comments were more directed towards the vegetative buffer, boardwalks, or ideas like that within the waterfront designation to make sure that those are waterfront related activities like a boardwalk, like a dock, so on and forth. But it was specifically in the vegetative buffer versus the overall development, if I'm not mistaken.
Oh, I believe you're correct. So does that work for you, Mr. McDonald, then?
That is correct, but I'm just aware that there is another submission. I think it's the Muskoka Lakes Association have some concerns about the wellness center. So I just want to make sure that we're not creating an impediment to the wellness center going where it wants to go. And if we're okay with that, and that's not the intent, I'm fine to modify the wording with that understanding.
So could I don't see any hands up. So can I get a thumbs up if we agree that this is about the vegetative buffer and not the wellness center? I think we're good. Mayor Harding, would you like to speak? I don't know if your hands up from before or not.
If it was, thank you, Madam Chair. I think just to next comments that, we need to specify that the wellness center is also included in that concept. And again, I think it's a 66-foot closer, vegetative buffer versus, maybe 100 feet back or 80 feet back, so on and so forth. So just as long as we're all, I don't think anyone on this Zoom call right now is anti-wellness center. So thank you.
Okay, thank you. My next note is adding in Bruce Lake, which I'm not anticipating we're going to have an issue with. So we would like to add Bruce Lake into, let me get my notes out again. Section C1.2 and C1.4.2B, or wherever it's appropriate also, Mr. McDonald. So do I have it? Oh, Mayor Harding?
Sorry, just a quick question to Mr. McDonald and Mr. Pink, because I don't believe any of these lands actually abut Bruce Lake. So I appreciate that we want to actually, make sure that all lakes in the area and the whole overall health system. I just wonder, is there potential inadvertent consequence of adding the word Bruce Lake in here that really have no effect on Bruce Lake or not? Just especially because there's no, I don't believe, touching water body or property lands.
Mr. McDonald?
I don't think there's any downside to including it. Bruce Lake is not that far away from the northern extent of this. And really by adding Bruce Lake into the equation, we're just making sure that the more detailed studies take Bruce Lake into account in the study process. That's it.
Mr. Pink would like to say something.
I think just to add really quickly as well, I could be mistaken on this, but I believe the far northern reaches of Minett actually flow into the watershed of Bruce Lake. So it doesn't always have to abut either to have impact. So I think that is where that comment is driven from.
Thank you. Councillor Nishikawa.
Thank you. David, actually just said what I was going to say. Certainly Bruce Lake was hugely involved with the development of the Marriott, and I in the back of my mind was wondering for quite some time why they weren't we weren't hearing more of the discussion over the years. So thank you. I think it should be included because it did have huge impacts from the development perspective, what happened in the past.
Okay, so public access, which was a concern raised by the developer, and I'm going to continue managing. I'm going to ask maybe Mr. Pink or Mr. McDonald to explain what their issue was with this draft in that regard. The public access, in terms of, does that mean, I think it's to Councillor Kelly's point too, does that mean everybody can come to the beach and whatever? So Mr. Pink, do you want to take that?
Certainly. And again, Mr. McDonald may wish to add his comments if he reads it differently, but there are two policies, in particular C1445 and C175D, which allude to the municipality's desire to ensure that public access is either preserved and or enhanced if that is desired by the community. It certainly, my read of the policy certainly wouldn't tie your hands that you must take a public beach, for example, through a parkland dedication or enhance public access, but through either docking or the master parkland or trails exercise, we would look to ensure that the public has access to the water body, as I believe Member Edwards previously alluded to. Ms. Bustard's submission notes concerns with that approach and wishing to not go down that road. So that's certainly my take of the submission received and the way the policies are currently written. I see Nick nodding.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that that's exactly right. Public access is a great thing to have, but it's part of the negotiation with the developer going forward. And it may be a component of a parks master plan, or it may not. So it's part of the discussion. And I think what the additions to the policy say is that public access is encouraged, but the determination of how that actually happens is left for another day and another conversation.
Okay, thank you. So I am going to ask, I guess we're going to leave that as it is written at this point. Can I get agreement on that? Yeah. Good, okay. The other concern was the slopes, the areas of use limitation, which is policy C1-5-4-1. Of 40%, the slope steeper than 40%. That has now been reduced in this draft to 20%. Great concern by the developer that actually will limit development in some areas and make the other areas even denser. So do I have anybody who wants to look at changing what's in front of us now or commenting on this at this point? All right, I think I'm going to take that then. Oh, Councillor Jaglowitz.
Thank you, Chair. I just would appreciate maybe an explanation of why it was changed, just so we understand the reason for the change, and then kind of answer what the objection is from the proponent.
Hey, Mr. McDonald.
Yeah, so I'll start with that. So the draft amendment that I received before, I guess the version that was prepared before I got involved had the 40% in it. And as I became more intimately aware of the township's current policies, everywhere else in the township, it's 20%. So what we did is basically made the policy reflect the township standard overall. So that is a reduction. The policy as written does allow for environmental impact studies to be completed. But the starting point is that if you're on a slope greater than 20%, then the use of that slope for development is discouraged, as it is everywhere else in the township. So we could look at that wording a little bit more to provide some additional flexibility. We also understand the proponent's perspective that, well, if we don't permit development on every slope, that means very little land is available for development. So the one takeaway is we'll look at that some more, but that's where the 20% came from. It is the township standard beyond which development is discouraged.
Okay, thank you. Mayor Harding.
Yeah, thank you very much. Through you to Mr. McDonald. I guess as we go back and take a look a little bit at this, it'd be interesting to sort of overlay how much of the property would be able to be developed and how much wouldn't be able to develop. I think that's a smart point to get to. Is it 20%, maybe it's 30%, maybe it's 40% slope, but just to have a little better handle on where we're going. And again, remember, we're talking about an official plan. So we're really ratcheting down and locking this stuff down. Unfortunately, the more prescribed we are, you know, we're going to potentially increase densities in the low flatland, which exists in Wallace Bay right now, versus maybe pushing some stuff back because there might be a 20% slope. So I don't know exactly what the definition is going to be or what the mapping is going to look like.
Okay, so Mr. McDonald.
Yeah, I guess through to you, Mr. Mayor Harding, I'm not sure we can come up with a map that tells you where those slopes are unless we did some analysis and some work. What I'd rather do is look at the policy and determine if it provides enough flexibility, because I'm also concerned about it being too limiting. So if you could leave that with me, that's the best I can do. But we don't want to create a circumstance where we've created so many limitations on where you can do things that everything gets loaded up in one area. And that's certainly not our intent. And I'm sure it's not this committee's intent either. So we will provide a bit of reporting on that when we come back with this.
Supplemental, if I may, Chair Bridgman, I think,
Yes.
you know, the topographical mapping that the district does have might give us an indication that this little block might become problematic or maybe not become problematic. So I think that would certainly guide us potentially. Mr. Pink, I think, wants to speak.
Mr. Pink.
I just wanted to chime in a little bit. We do have access to topographic mapping, and actually mapping that's been prepared that identifies those areas that are 20 to 40, 40 to 60, and 60 greater. I could probably screen share if I can find my password and dig it up in the next few minutes. But I did want to clarify that the way I read the policies, and maybe I misheard Mr. McDonald comment, but I don't believe it's prohibiting development on slopes over 20%. The policy encourages retention of vegetation on slopes over 20%. And if that can't occur, then an environmental review should be undertaken. So I would share the concern of Ms. Bustard if the policy was such that it prohibited development on 20% slopes. They are fairly ubiquitous in the township, as most are aware. There are slopes down to the water in Muskoka. That's pretty common. And 20% is not extreme. So it does just encourage the retention of vegetation in those areas and allows some further review if we feel that an excessive amount of vegetation is being removed to accommodate development. But again, Mr. McDonald and I are happy to look at that and provide some greater clarity when it comes back to ensure that we're not too prescriptive and sort of tying down and prohibiting any development in the area. That was not the intention.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Pink. So I believe that we'll just leave that with you and you can come back to us with that. Unless anybody has any issues with that, we'll just carry on from there. All right, floodplain. I know the proponent has asked, from what I can read, basically to be allowed to build in the floodplain that has been mapped by the district. So do we have any comments on that from anybody? Unless I'm misinterpreting what they had said. Mayor Harding.
Thank you. I guess my question is to staff. So we're using district floodplain mapping in this particular regard. We do know that we've used in the past environmental protection zone mapping, but as we get to specific development, when you get in, and do an individual assessment. Sometimes they're not EP zones, or they may not be flood zones. My understanding, the district mapping is what I'll call a 30,000 foot view. Aerial, okay, all of this area gets encompassed, but when you start to develop, it may not be actually in a floodplain. I agree 100%. We should not allow any floodplain development. But does the policy, or will it allow for some individual studies in individual areas? And that's what I want to make sure, that we're not blocking off 40% of a development site because of what one map says when it may not be accurate.
Fair enough. Mr. McDonald.
Yes, through you to Mayor Harding. Yes, the mapping that we have now is simply based on an elevation, and it is 30,000 feet up, but it is still pretty accurate. I think what Ms. Bustard's point is that they want to be able to look at it in some more detail, and perhaps through that process refine the floodplain mapping, and perhaps suggest that certain structures that are not habitable in nature be permitted, and the policies would allow for that to occur through the implementation process.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Nishikawa.
Thank you. I guess my concerns were some that the mayor brought forward. Again, not enough information for me to go in one direction or another at this moment. Of course, we don't want development in a flood area. I will say, though, that there are different construction techniques. There's a whole lot of other things to take into consideration. And the sad thing is that I lived in British Columbia, where a lot of things were built on peat moss. So I'm just saying that there's lots of options, but I don't have the full information. We just have that one district overview, and I believe it should be fine-tuned, but there's not something that I can say today, a thumbs up, that that's the direction I'm going in, other than the broad comment that we don't want development generally in the floodplain. But again, difficult when we really don't know a full picture of what it was thought of or being planned, and also those areas that may or may not be affected, because my experience in some of that mapping is it's a little too broad in some areas, I'll just say. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. So I think my understanding is that this is written with that flexibility to be able to have those other studies and look at the other building possibilities, Mr. McDonald. Am I correct?
That's absolutely correct. We're not talking today about what can happen there. All we're saying is that through the master planning process, proposals will be made for the whole area, which include those components that are in the floodplain, and that's the appropriate time to figure out what can happen.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Jaglowitz.
Actually, Chair Brisbane, you asked the question I was going to. Thank you. So I don't need to.
Okay, so I believe we're going to leave that with you in terms of keeping that flexible. And I think that was my list that I picked up from concerns that have already been expressed. So I will now ask councillors if there are other areas that they would like to have a look at. Councillor Jaglowitz, then Councillor Edwards.
Thank you, Chair. As I brought up earlier, I'm referring to section C1.6.1.3D, dealing with resort-related residential dwelling units. What a phrase! And so if Mr. McDonald, if you could just help me, that particular section says that those units shall not exceed 30% of the total number of units permitted on those lands depicted on Schedule C. And once again, Schedule C has a lot of land, so I assume you're referring to, I'm not sure what you're referring to there. And then it goes on to say, and inclusive of resort-related residential dwelling units in the VC, RC1, and RC2 designations, subject to section C16.1.4 below. C16.1.4 has got A, B, C, D, E, F, and G. So I wonder in layman's terms, could you just tell me what that section is saying?
McDonald.
Yes, certainly. So the 30%, and admittedly, when you look at track changes and you make all these changes, sometimes things get lost in translation. But the 30% is a cap on the number of total units permitted within the village core and the RC1 and the RC2 designations. So it's not 30% of the total, it's 30% in that area only. So it's 882, 30% of 882, basically.
And just to clarify something, it doesn't matter whether that 30%, if they decide to build that type of unit in the R1 zone.
That's correct.
Still,
that's a permission.
But it still counts to the 30%. So what you're saying is take 30% of 882, and that's the number of RDUs that are allowed in total on the property. Is that? Because I just want to clarify, if you read the definition of that RR whatever, it just says this is a residential unit like a house in Oakville in a commercial zone. That's the definition of it, right?
That's correct.
It's nothing special. It's just permitted in a commercial zone, but it has to be part of a fully integrated development, which is okay. So that's a key one for me. So I just wanted to make sure, can we multiply 30% times 882, and that's the total number of those type of units in the property.
That's absolutely correct.
Thank you.
Okay, so could I ask for further clarification? Because I'm now not quite sure that I understand. 30% of all of the units that are built, only 30% can be that, correct?
Okay, I'm going to back up now. So we've got three types of units. We have resort commercial accommodation units, which are those units that are clearly part of the resort. They have to be in the rental program. And then we have the resort related residential uses, which is those 30%, which have to be functionally related to the resort. And then we have the straight residential uses, which don't have to be functionally related to resort, and they are only permitted in the R1 and the R2 designations. So you have three types of units being permitted in this context. So the 30% is on the village core and the RC1 and RC2. We fully expect a resort to be developed on those lands. And the total number of units permitted is 882. And of those 882, 30% can be units that are not in the rental program. That's basically what that's saying. And then you have across the road, you can have full residential. They're in a resort, they're not in a resort, but they're full residential, and that's a permission. Hopefully that's clear.
Thank you.
Sorry about being not clear the first time.
No, just sometimes I need to hear it twice. All right. So anybody else have any? Oh,
so
sorry,
maybe,
Councillor Zach. Go ahead.
Sorry, does that mean, I just want to clarify that maybe you could clarify that wording. Could you, Nick, in there just to make it clear? It's hard to read.
And sometimes I wish I can write policy as I speak, because when I speak, it's clear, but when I write it, sometimes it's not. So let me do that. But clearly, I think we all understand what's proposed. It's just making sure it's clearly written.
But when we get to the OLT or wherever this may end up someday, we want to make sure the wording reflects what you just said.
Fair enough.
Okay, Councillor Roberts.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and through you and to Director Pink. I couldn't find within the OP anything that restricts lockouts. Where do I find that? I know it was discussed.
Okay, so Director Pink, just Councillor Roberts and I had a quick conversation today. In our working group, we said you can't have a lock-off unit with an independent door to a corridor, so an owner couldn't stay in their section if the rest of it's rented out. And I'm not sure that that made it through to the OPA here, so I'm going to turn this over to you now.
Thank you. My recollection, I stand to be corrected, but that was in earlier drafts, quite detailed drafts that included very specific definitions of gross floor area. And I believe it was determined quite a few meetings ago, or perhaps still at the working group, that that was a bit too detailed for official plan policy, and those types of definitions would be left to the zoning stage. So I believe that was why it was taken out.
Okay, Councillor Roberts.
I just want confirmation.
Councillor Roberts, sorry.
Thank you. Thank you. Can you hear me?
I can.
Okay, thank you. I just want to ensure that this is not possible going forward, wherever it is. I have witnessed this weekend at a resort within Ward B that it's very possible. So,
Okay, so
I just wanted to know whether it goes in the official plan, but I don't want it to be lost.
I don't think it belongs in the official plan, is what we agree, what we agreed to. Correct, Mr. McDonald?
That's correct. I mean, when I looked at this section, first it was an appendix, and the appendix was quite broad, and the appendix is really not a formal part of the official plan. Then I decided that it may make more sense, and the district also made the same comment, that perhaps we include this within the actual amendment itself. But a lot of what's in here, quite frankly, is not what you typically find in an official plan in any event. So I was trying to pick those elements that I thought were the most important and include them within the amendment itself. There comes a point where some of this stuff, some of it may not be enforceable, but I just want to make sure we're not creating something that isn't able to be implemented.
So just a final supplemental to Director Pink. Director Pink, I'll look to you to make sure that that does get in the zoning bylaws or whatever, because I did witness it. It'd be very possible one of our resorts on the weekend. Thank you.
Director, making a note of that. Okay, yes, Director Pink is doing that. Councillor Zavitz.
Thank you, and through you to David, if I might. A different topic slightly, staff housing, given the experience over here in Bala. And now I want to talk about what may just well happen in Minett. David, given your experience with the Bala scenario, we know we're talking about, as it relates to the Marriott, but more specifically to that area, will there be an allowance for, if I might use the word uppercase, all staff housing? Will this now become this area's staff housing solution, in that, Legacy has 6 people working there? I don't know. 39 people at the Marriott and 174 people at the new Cleveland's House Resort, if I might. What do you feel, David? Are we there? I need that assurance. I really do need to know, not so much that they're going to pull out a Bala. That's not what I'm saying. I'm simply saying, have we shored this up enough so that we can insist as a township that the staff for those locales are actually situated there? Thank you.
Okay, sorry, Director.
Sorry, unmuted myself too quick. Through you. I think my comments would be, I can never sort of hate guaranteeing anything, but I think it is difficult to be retroactive. And certainly in the past, I think the municipality should have been more, requiring of staff housing as opposed to encouraging it. But I think we're taking excellent steps both in this OPA that Mr. McDonald's going to just make that more clear in the next draft, but also in our broader official plan review, that new developments going forward, commercial or resort developments, will require on-site staff housing. And I think that's finally taking the steps in the right direction. Perhaps another thought that I know has been talked about in the past that I think will further encourage that, and that could either, perhaps it's a little late at this stage, but perhaps with the broader official plan review, I don't know if past developers perhaps didn't implement or construct staff housing, as it would eat into their very important unit counts or development allowances with respect to gross floor area or lot coverage. And that might be something we consider through the broader official plan review to stipulate that the accommodation of staff housing on resort properties will not result in deficiencies in gross floor area, lot coverage, or unit counts, will not count towards those limitations. Because I think we want to do everything we can to encourage, or in this case now require, staff housing to be on these properties, because we do recognize it has created issues in a number of communities. It does come up regularly, and I think we are taking appropriate steps to address that.
Okay, Councillor Edwards.
Thank you, Chair. I noticed in the red line, we changed a lot of words to shall. And I just want to make sure that shall is mandatory and not discretion. Shall is mandatory and not discretionary. And that because I have heard different things on it. We do have that in one of our bylaws and I just wanted to make sure that there's no wiggle room there. That's one thing. And as a comment on staff housing, it should be staff housing and not trailers, and that so that we're very, very concerned that they're not just going to put a bunch of trailers in like other areas have tried to do and done, and that it's proper housing for staff. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. McDonald. Would you like to comment on those?
Yes, firstly, shall is mandatory. We've had that conversation through the official plan review. With respect to staff housing not being in trailers, we don't specify within the draft OPA at this point that that can't occur. It may actually work in certain circumstances, so I'm not sure we want to not permit that. Again, we're getting into a conversation that's probably better had when we actually get a zoning application with a site plan and we see what is proposed in terms of staff housing. I'm certainly aware that the concept plans prepared to date do show an element of staff housing. So I think we can leave that conversation for that time. But I wouldn't want to discount it because I think it could work in the proper location. My personal view.
Hey, Councillor Jaglowitz.
Thank you, Chair. Through you to Nick. Just following on Councillor Roberts' question about the lockup, in your explanation that C19 contains only 6 items of a much larger list that was an appendix. So I wonder if it's still appropriate or if it's appropriate to still have the appendix in addition to those 6 points with the remaining points that should be considered by zoning or master plan. Because by only including 6 items, one may interpret that those are the only things that matter and it's not appropriate to have the others. So I just wanted, you might give that some consideration. Thank you.
Mr. McDonald?
That's actually not a bad suggestion. We could consider that. So there's a way we can satisfy all of those things. So yes, that's something we can look at.
Okay, Councillor Jaglowitz, your hand is still up. I'm assuming that you're done. Thank you. All right, any other comments? Councillor Jaglowitz, I think your hand, is it up or down?
I'm fine.
Okay. Okay, so it's down?
Yes, it's down.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. All right, so I'm not seeing any other, I am seeing Councillor Mazan. I think it's your real hand.
Yes, it is. Thank you very much. I think I have 2 questions and it's not intended. My first question isn't really intended to open up something, but it's an observation I've made through today's discussions and listening to our constituents. And it would seem that there is concern as it relates to this wellness center. And something I've heard, and I think, so if I'm reading things correctly, when we think about the shoreline and the buffer and the vegetative buffer there, when we're thinking about the height, it seems to come back to, once again, this wellness center. And I guess without trying to be over prescriptive, and I think, Nick, that you brought this up, and trying to listen to the needs of both parties, you know, do we have the policies in place to ensure that built form isn't such a dominant presence on our shoreline, but it is allowing for the flexibility that the proponent is saying, that to build something appropriately in this space. That's what I'm looking for. I'm looking to the experts to ensure that the concerns that are coming from the community are being heard, and that the proponent is being given the flexibility and to be able to build something that is, you know, reflective of their vision. And in the absence of knowing their vision, you know, I'm left here sitting, trying to listen to all of these audiences saying, this is the place where we start that vision. So I don't know if it's a question, or I'm looking for an assurance or some further thinking to say, you brought it up, saying that you'd heard or read through the MLA, there was some concern, especially in the vegetated shoreline. And I want to make sure that I'm understanding that as we hand this back to you. And then the other portion, and unfortunately I did get kicked out, was around the actual height of the buildings. And I think it was also once again centered on this iconic wellness center that now I'm very much looking forward to going to. So let me be noting the record for that. I don't know if there's a real question in there, or I'm looking for assurance in this next draft that both parties might be satisfied that the concerns are being heard.
Mr. McDonald?
Excellent question. That's a perfect lawyer question for someone on the stand. I like that. That's really good. So I think that there is quite a bit of flexibility in the policies while also being prescriptive. And I do think that there is an opportunity to allow for something quite beautiful and without having significant impacts on the character of the area occurring. So how that balance gets determined will be through the next exercise you're in, when the application for rezoning is submitted and you see a fully thought out concept plan. That's where the big conversation really begins. But I think that we've built enough flexibility in there while trying to protect the township's interests and react to the many comments that have been made. Finding that balance is very, very elusive. I think we're pretty close right now.
Okay, does Councillor Mazan, you have a follow-up?
I think in the absence of knowing what this next stage is, as a person who lives in this area, there is concern, right? Because it's really outside of our control, and we want to make sure that we put everything in place. And I think I'm not, again, trying to open up something, but I just wanted that when we consider the height of buildings, and we have shifted to the 16 meters, I think that's what the committee had recommended. You know, I'm just making sure that that is the direction we would want to be going in. If the rest of the township is 14 meters, that was going to be my supplementary question. There seems to be this push to the 16 meters and then allowing for some further flexibility. So again, I'm hearing through your height master plan that is where we can address some of these things. Is that correct, Mr. McDonald?
That's absolutely correct. And the way this whole amendment is set up is it sets out the guidance, it sets out the policies under which everything else can happen. I think it sets out the policies in an appropriate way, but it gives you as a council the ultimate authority in the end to make a decision on what really works on the land after all the studies are submitted and you see a fully thought out concept plan. You may not like certain elements of it, and then what happens is a whole series of negotiations happen, and hopefully you end up in a place where everybody is happy, right? So we don't have that in front of us now. We're trying to create a framework in the absence of having the detail. I think we're doing a pretty good job of doing that, but there is a huge check and balance at the end of this process, because you have to approve a rezoning application as a council that will bring all of this together in a manner that you're satisfied with. So that's the ultimate test. And that's what we're hoping to get to as soon as possible, because I know the proponent's very interested in proceeding quickly with this.
So if I could, Madam Chair, could I have one other set of questions? And it actually is completely unrelated, but it has to do with C1.8, the definition sections. As I was listening to Mr. Newall speak, I kept thinking to myself, I like having clarity. So I saw the definition of unit owner, and then we introduced something new under, or at least this is how I read it, under the resort commercial accommodation unit provisions. When we talk about, and if the unit is owned individually. So for somebody who likes to have clarity and consistency, and I think that's what we were touching upon earlier, but I like it when things are clear and concise. So not introducing a new concept would be helpful. And my next comment is actually seeking to understand, we did a pretty good job of definitions, and then we get to gross floor area. And then it's suggested that this is better done in the implementing zoning bylaw. And I was wondering why that wouldn't have been included as a more fulsome definition here, given we've done it for others.
Mr. McDonald?
Yeah, I'll take a stab at the gross floor area. There are other elements of gross floor area that are dealt with in a zoning bylaw. So for example, do you measure from the outside walls or the middle of a wall? And what do you include and not include? Those are the elements that you typically see in a zoning bylaw and are not in here. Mr. Pink can probably expand upon that, but that's really what that was all about, is exactly how you measure.
Okay, so I gather Mr. Pink feels you did a great job, Mr. McDonald, on that. So we'll move on to Councillor Zavitz.
Thank you, and through you. Simple question, I think. Do we know the existing height of Cleveland House? The main building? Like to the very top?
Yes, I believe Mr. Pink looked that up for us.
No.
Oh, that was the JW.
That was a Marriott.
Yeah, right. No, I don't think we have that.
So it's interesting. Okay, no, so if I might, I mean, here we are talking about 14 meters, 16 meters. It could well be, if it's 16 meters now, or I don't know, 12. I mean, I think that there's some basic information we kind of require. And I think I would like to know what that is, just to maybe more for peace of mind or information than anything. Thank you.
Well, I'm thinking maybe we could get that back to you at council. Move this forward, and then we can look at it at the council. Councillor Jagowitz.
Thank you, Chair. And this is going to be my final interaction. I think what I'm going to say might help Councillor Maston. She talked about she would like to see the vision, and I'd like to talk about that for a minute. Basically, I support the concept plan that the proponent, Mr. Goldhar, presented to the Muskoka Joint Review Policy Statement Committee in Bracebridge about 3 years ago. And this concept was reinforced to me and to others earlier this year. And I believe even Ms. Bustard presented part of it to us. And what that concept plan, and I've confirmed this with Mr. Goldhar, it calls for a resort mainly owned by the hotel operator, and in the way Cleveland's House was. There may be some parts that are not owned, but most will be and rented out. And I think it'll be an excellent development. And I think we've done an excellent job of trying to do ours. And I think it's time to move this forward and allow a developer to give us something that meets that vision and that we will all be proud of. So I suggest that we move this forward to council with the amendments that we talked about today. Thank you.
Thank you for the segue, because I was just about to read the motion once there were no more hands up. So there we go. All right. Moved by Councillor Edwards, seconded by Councillor Roberts. Be it resolved that Planning Committee recommend to Township Council the draft official plan amendment number 56 attached as Appendix 2 to report plan 2021-66 be adopted and forwarded to the District of Muskoka for approval. And that the District of Muskoka be requested to amend the Muskoka official plan to include the foundational elements included in section C1.2 titled Development Plan, a servicing schedule, and to ensure overall conformity with official plan amendment. Now, some of the rewriting of this, do we not need to put that in here?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, so we'll just be a second, just in terms of the suggestions we've made and some of the changes. So while we're waiting for Mr. Pink there, I would also like to recap the process and thank everybody for the input and the developer working with us. I believe it's the first time this council's ever had a working group that involved, thank you, council members and public and the developer. So lots of time and effort went into this. And it's been, I think, as everybody has said, very successful. So thank you to everybody. All right, I'm going to quickly reread this. Moved by Councillor Edwards, seconded by Councillor Roberts. Be it resolved that Planning Committee recommend to Township Council the draft official plan amendment number 56 attached as Appendix 2 to report plan 2021-66 as directed to be amended at the October 25th, 2021 Special Planning Committee meeting, be adopted and forwarded to the District of Muskoka for approval, and that the District of Muskoka be requested to amend the Muskoka official plan to include the foundational elements included in section C1.2 titled Development Plan, a surfacing schedule, and to ensure all over conformity with official plan amendment 56. Any discussion? All in favor? Madam Clerk, I believe that's unanimous. All right, carried. Okay, thank you. All right, well, thank you, everyone. And I'm going to close the meeting now. I almost made it to an AM closing, but thank you again for everybody being succinct. Oh, it says Hayes. Okay. Okay, moved by Councillor Kelly, seconded by Councillor Mazan. Be it resolved that the Special Planning Committee meeting adjourn at 12:23 p.m. and the next regular Planning Committee meeting will be held on Thursday, November 11th, 2021 at 9 a.m. electronically from the Council Chambers, Municipal Offices in Port Carling, Ontario. All in favor? All right, Madam Clerk, you finished your last official meeting. Okay. Okay. Yay. Yeah,
Flawless performance.
yeah.